For the past year, I had longed for a change. Eager to break free from the boring and monotonous routine my life had settled into. When change finally arrived, however, it was not in the way I had hoped for. I was attending Miller's Academy, a prestigious boarding school that nurtures the talents of physically inclined students, a place where I didn't fit in at all. My father, being a driven, strict, and self-centered man, had insisted I attend the same institute he'd once excelled at. His words still echoed through my mind. "You need to build some character, son." I could only laugh at those words. He had forgotten one crucial detail. While he'd been a thriving athlete, I was the polar opposite. A nerd. Mom had always understood me, but after her death, there was no one to challenge Dad's decisions. I protested, of course, but as so often, my pleas fell on deaf ears. Yet his intentions couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't just about character or life lessons. No, this was a way to have his annoying son out of the way. When the bus finally arrived at the isolated campus in the middle of nowhere, it became clear why he had been so adamant about sending me there. The school's motto, "Train hard, succeed boldly," loomed over the entry gate. What a farce, I thought, as I stepped inside. My eyes wandered upward on the towering walls that surrounded the school grounds. They made me feel tiny, trapped, and as if I'd entered a prison rather than a school. Mr. Muller, the head football coach, welcomed me, but his scrutinizing gaze and squinted eyes told me what I already knew. I didn't belong here. As he led me past pristine training facilities and state-of-the-art sports fields, he rambled on about potential, sportsmanship, and team spirit. God, I hated this place already. As my eyes wandered around and I watched the teaming activity all around me, it became clear this was a breeding ground for the kids of rich families and star athletes. The curriculum of Miller's Academy was bare bones at best. Nothing more than a facade. The school's focus became even more obvious in its plethora of extracurricular activities. Morning training sessions, weight training, team practices, and more than a dozen sports clubs to choose from. As my eyes wandered over the endless lists of clubs and activities, I sighed. Eventually, my eyes came to rest on track and field. Participation in at least one club was mandatory. And as I signed up, I hoped it would be less intense than wrestling or football. I had hoped to join clubs related to my interests in physics, astronomy, and modern technology. Back at my old school, I'd immersed myself in physics experiments, joined the astronomy club during late-night stargazing, and even built mechanical gadgets in the robotics club. When I asked Mr. Muller about such clubs, the man scoffed dismissively. "We've got no place and time for that nonsense at Miller's Academy," he replied, shaking his head, as if I'd just committed a terrible affront. During my first 2 semesters, I spent most of my days hiding in the school's meager and half-forgotten library, only accompanied by a few lonely stragglers who were behind on their studies, or couldn't partake in their clubs because of injury. These days ended when the school announced a costly renovation and construction project to modernize not only the gym, but the main building's eastern wing. With only a few words, we were informed that not only the STEM facility and computer lab, but also the library would be closed down. After that, all that remained was my dorm room, where I spent my days reading science fiction novels and browsing the internet. Mrs. Richter, our dorm mother, noticed, of course. She was a friendly, older woman, an understanding one, but she often tried a little too hard to motivate me. "Why don't you ever hang out with your friends, Stephen? We got all these clubs, and here you are, hiding away in your dorm room." All it did was ruin what little solitude I'd found, and filled me with guilt, as if I was the one in the wrong here. Strange, even, and not meant for this school. My 2 roommates, Eric and Martin, turned out to be decent guys beneath their intimidating demeanor, and I'd even call them friends. The problem was, they were typical jocks, and to them, I was a nerd. This made the occasional teasing a mandatory part of our interactions. Even worse, our friendship rarely extended beyond the confines of our dorm room. They were always busy with their grueling training regimes, got up an hour before me because of morning training, attended various club activities in the afternoon, and reserved their early evenings for weight training. During my first futile attempts to join them during practice, I was nothing but an afterthought. Left to hang out near them, not with them, while they joked around with their other friends. Half the time, I felt like a stranger at Miller's Academy, a foreign element that didn't belong. The other half, it was merely tolerable. During my third semester, all that changed, and it was related to one of the few people I got along with, our physics teacher, Mr. Thomas. At Miller's Academy, monotony ruled, but Mr. Thomas was one of the few exceptions. While most of the teachers were as disinterested in their normal classes as the student body, he seemed to truly care. Given my interest in physics, I participated actively during his lectures, and always asked questions, much to the disdain of other students, who made sure not to keep their groans and snide remarks to themselves. Mr. Thomas, however, more than welcomed my interest, and one day, at the end of class, came up to me to elaborate further on a certain question. I was more than happy to discuss it with him, and it soon became a weekly thing. We ended up talking about various topics, and he frequently recommended books he'd enjoyed. Even before the school's library had closed down, few of those books were available there. So, once a week, during what few off-campus hours Miller's Academy allowed, I ventured into the small nearby town of Willow Grove. While others hung out with friends or family, I spent my time at a small bookstore. I always stocked up on books, be they fiction or non-fiction. By this point, half the shelf in my dorm room was filled with books on physics and robotics, but also space operas and other science fiction novels. My newest edition was A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. When I showed it to Mr. Thomas after class, he smiled at me. "Oh, that's a good one. Did you read it already, Stephen?" "Only the first chapter, but it's interesting. You read it too, right?" He gave a short laugh before he nodded. "Of course. I've read everything by Hawking. Brilliant man." "I was wondering about something, though." I started, asking him a specific detail about Newton's law of universal gravitation. Mr. Thomas began to answer my question, but as so often, it resulted in a half-hour banter about astrophysics. I could tell he was always happy to talk to me. Most of the other students usually spaced out during his lectures. To them, it was nothing but a necessary evil, similar to the rest of the curriculum. We didn't talk about Stephen Hawking's book much that day, since I'd barely started reading it, but Mr. Thomas urged me to continue and said that Chapter 4 was sure to give me a lot of questions. For the rest of the day, and pretty much the rest of the week, I locked myself away in my dorm room and devoured it. When next week arrived, I was stoked. Mr. Thomas had been right. There were so many things in the book that I didn't fully understand. Once lunch break was over, it was time for physics class, but I barely paid any attention. While Mr. Thomas explained to a bored class how transistors and transformers worked, I looked through all the notes I'd taken. I knew we wouldn't have time to go over everything, so I picked out the questions that gave me the biggest headaches. When class finally ended, I gathered up my things and made my way to his desk. When he noticed me standing there, he simply stared at me. His eyes were wide. His mouth was slightly twitching, and not a hint of emotions showed on his face. "What is it?" he eventually asked in a monotonous voice. I looked up, a bit surprised. He was usually excited about our little talks, but today he seemed completely disinterested. "So, about the book," I started, shuffling around awkwardly under his probing gaze. "I read it twice already. It's amazing, but I don't even know where to start. There's so much I don't understand." When he said nothing, I quickly continued, in the hopes of drowning out the awkward silence between us. I noted down a few questions, and I was wondering if... "What questions?" He cut me off, without the slightest change to his voice. "Well, it's about Chapter 4. It's really tough, like you said. I don't understand the uncertainty principle. Like, what does it mean?"
It's the concept that precise, simultaneous measurements of some complementary variables, such as the position and momentum of a subatomic particle, are possible, he recited. Anything else?
Yes. I mean, I read that, but what does it actually mean?
It means that precise, simultaneous measurements of some complementary variables, such as the position and measurement of a subatomic particle, are possible.
You said that already. But what's meant by...
Anything else?
I don't know. All my other questions just go a bit more into this, so...
Good. That's it then.
With that, he turned away from me and gathered up his teaching materials. I watched him, utterly dumbfounded. He hadn't sounded angry or annoyed, just indifferent. I wanted to say something else and open my mouth, but before I could get a word out, he had left the room. I looked after him, wondering what the hell was wrong with him. The goodbye I murmured was ignored as well. For a moment, I watched as he walked down the hallway to his office, but I told myself he must have just had a bad day. Hell, the way he walked, slouched over and taking one step at a time, told me just how exhausted he was. By the next day, I'd already shrugged off his behavior and decided to hit him up again. Maybe he'd have a few minutes today. After classes had ended for the day, I made my way to his office and knocked on the door, but got no response. Eventually, after I'd knocked a few more times, I could see something moving behind the smoked glass, and a moment later, Mr. Thomas opened it.
Classes have ended for the day,
he blurted out, almost mechanically.
Students should make their way to their dorms and get ready for their extracurricular activities.
But, Mr. Thomas, I protested, it won't take long. Really, I just wanted to...
Classes have ended for the day. Students should make their way back to their dorms and get ready for their extracurricular activities,
he repeated. For a few more seconds, he stared at me with the same wide eyes and the same twitching mouth, before he threw the door right in my face. I was left speechless. He was usually so friendly and always up for a chat. This behavior wasn't like him. Not at all. Something had to be wrong with him. Back at the dorms, I tried to tell myself not to think about it too much. Who knows? Maybe he'd gotten some bad news or was going through a rough time. Hell, maybe he'd just gotten sick of our talks, I thought, frustrated. Most teachers must have chosen their position at Miller's Academy because they knew they'd have an easy time. Maybe it was the same for him. As much as I tried to tell myself to ignore his behavior, I couldn't help but watch him whenever I saw him in the hallways. That's how I noticed it wasn't merely his behavior that was odd, but also his way of walking now. It looked mechanical, almost studied, as if he was trying his best to act like the people around him so he'd not stick out. Yet somehow, he didn't get it right. It looked as if each of his steps was well planned, and took him a tremendous effort, a fact he was desperately trying to hide. During my next physics class, I noticed even more details. The way he held the chalk, the way his hands moved when he wrote on the blackboard, and even his way of speaking were all slightly off. Then I stopped and rubbed my temples. What the hell was I even doing? Still, I couldn't shake off the strange feeling that something was wrong. And after only a few minutes, I watched him again. I saw how wide and empty his eyes were, and how the corners of his mouth were continuously, slightly twitching. Was he really just sick? Then, slowly, another thought crawled into my mind. An outlandish one. What if something had happened to him, and for whatever reason he tried to hide it by acting like he usually did, but was getting it slightly wrong? Or, I thought with a shudder, almost right. When he suddenly turned towards class, and his wide, empty eyes came to rest on me for a moment, I couldn't help but shiver. They weren't just empty. They were emotionless. As if he didn't care one bit about what he was doing, and wasn't even seeing us. As he explained something to the class, I finally realized why his way of speaking ticked me off so much. It was the way he pronounced his words. Some were a bit too stretched out, others half mumbled, and he lingered on certain vowels just a tad bit too long. I looked around, wondering if anyone else had noticed what I had. But no one else seemed to pay any attention in class. Some students were chatting and joking around. Others didn't even pretend to be awake. That day, I didn't talk to him. I didn't even approach him. Instead, I packed my things and hurried from the classroom without so much as looking back. Before long, I wasn't merely watching Mr. Thomas. This new obsession led me to watch other members of the staff as well. At first, I found nothing amiss, but then I noticed that another teacher showed the same mechanical movements and the same irritating speech patterns. It was Mr. Flack, our math teacher. After math class had ended, I hurried outside and watched as Mr. Flack made his way down the hallway. The way he walked, the way his legs moved, it was the same as Mr. Thomas. His steps were a bit too wide, and he moved his legs in the same mechanical, almost robot-like fashion. Was he sick, too? It wasn't too far-fetched for two people to get sick, but for both to act exactly the same way? This weird and creepy? No. This had to be more than just a coincidence. The moment I saw Eric nearby, I elbowed him to get his attention.
Dude, what the hell?
He complained. Hey man, look at Mr. Flack, I said, pointing at the teacher who was still continuing on down the hallway, one cumbersome step after another.
Don't you think he's acting weird? The hell are you talking about? First all you do is read this dumb book, not talk to anyone. And now? Just look at the way he's walking. He's probably on his way to his next class, so what?
No, I mean, look how his legs move. Look how jerky they are. It's not normal at all. Eric eyed me suspiciously.
Hey, why the hell are you watching his legs? Are you, like, into him?
Fuck off, man. Something's wrong with him. Don't you see it?
I got no clue what the hell you're talking about.
I'm saying he's acting weird.
Yeah, as if teachers ever act normal. And Flack's a douchebag. That's all there is to it.
Jesus, I'm serious. I'm telling you.
Oh, whatever. You really need to get out more, dude, he said, shrugging.
I gave him a frustrated look, but he just walked off, joining some of his jock friends nearby. For the rest of the day, I tried to talk to some of my other classmates. In history, I tried to talk to Gabriel, but he told me I was acting like a weirdo. When I tried to talk to Annie, a studious girl I sat next to in English, she didn't even react to me. Yet, I knew what I'd seen, what I'd been watching for days. There was no way this was all just my imagination. Once English class had ended, our English teacher and Miller Academy's principal, Mrs. Wolfe, approached me. A feeling of unease washed over me, and I scanned their faces. As so often, she'd handed out a couple of worksheets before she busied herself with some other paperwork. Yet, I noticed nothing strange about her behavior.
Stephen, what's the matter with you today? Why are you so nervous? I've noticed you trying to talk to Annie all throughout class. Did something happen at the dorms? Are you being bullied?
No, that's not it, Mrs. Wolfe, I said, but she noticed the reluctance in my voice. With a few short words, she led me to her office, opened the door, and motioned for me to step inside. As she followed me, I watched as she put her bag down. For a second, it almost looked as if her arm was twisting backwards, making it look as if her joint had popped. I blinked, looked again, but everything was back to normal.
You can talk to me, Stephen, she said as she stepped up to me. I'm your teacher.
While I watched her, anxiety took hold of me. Yet, her eyes weren't wide or empty, and her mouth wasn't twitching. All I saw was the characteristic stoic expression the woman always wore on her face. That thing with her arm. Had I just imagined it? For a moment, it was quiet. But then I opened up about Mr. Thomas. I told her I thought something was wrong with him. As she listened, she paced around her office. But each of her steps seemed to lead her closer to the door. Was she trying to block my way out?
You think there's something wrong with him because of the way he moves and speaks? I assure you, those worries are completely groundless, Stephen. I can't share any details, of course, but Mr. Thomas has some private issues at the moment. It's nothing a student like yourself should be worried about. As she said this, her eyes were probing me, and for a second I wondered if she was making sure I understood her, or was trusting her lie. All the while, she was still slowly stepping closer towards the door. Mrs. Wolf? What are you doing? I asked, not able to keep my voice from cracking. I'm trying to help you, Stephen, that's all. She reached out for me and put her hand on my shoulder. For a second, I felt her fingers brush over it erratically, as if she wasn't in proper control of them. Then she pressed down, giving it a well-meaning squeeze. A moment later, her eyes grew wide, and she put her face in front of mine so fast I cringed back a step. I'm your teacher, after all. A surge of hot panic washed over me. In an instant, I freed myself from her grip and dashed past her. I stumbled out of the office and right into a group of passing students. "The hell's wrong with you, idiot?" one of them yelled at me. I ignored them and instead turned back to Mrs. Wolf's office. I could already see her coming after me, her hands reaching out for me to drag me back. Then imagination was replaced by reality, and I saw her just standing there, staring at me. Nothing was wrong with the way she carried her body or her eyes. The only difference to her stoic face was that her mouth was now nothing but a single hard line, as she stared me down with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "Get some sleep, Stephen," she snapped at me. "And if you'd be so kind, would you please close the door?" Her eyes were still focusing on me as I approached the door, one step at a time. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I got closer and closer to her. Yet, I didn't even know why. Didn't understand where this feeling was coming from. Apart from her stern look, there was nothing wrong with her. Nothing at all. Finally, my hand closed around the door handle, and with her still staring at me, I closed it. Only when I was halfway down the hallway did I realize where it had come from. The entire time while I'd approached her, I could have sworn she hadn't blinked a single time. Then I told myself once more that I was making things up. I'd been on edge all week. Hell, probably longer than that because of... well, because of what exactly? This was all getting to me. During lunch break, Eric and Martin joined me. They usually sat with the rest of their friends from the football club, but not today. The moment they sat down, Martin spoke up. "Alright, what's the matter with you these days?" "He thinks there's something wrong with the teachers," Eric spoke up, barely able to contain his amusement. "Probably because..." I was quick to cut him off and outlined to Martin what I'd noticed. At first, he just stared at me, but soon his face changed to a similarly amused expression. "Jesus, dude, what the hell? You need to get out more," he finally said, laughing. "That's what I said," Eric added. "You're making it all up because all you do is sit in your room, reading weird shit." I frowned. "Seriously, guys? Don't you see it? What about Mr. Flack and what about Mr. Thomas?" "He's probably just tired of your stupid questions," Martin suggested. "I mean, everyone else is too." "Yeah, fuck you too." "No, man, really, I mean, haven't you been pestering him about shit for months now?" I was about to snap back at him, but then I sighed. Not like it would do anything. I like those guys, I did, but sometimes they could be total assholes. My thoughts, however, soon lingered on what was going on with the teachers again. Yet, I couldn't even come up with an answer. No. All I knew was there was something wrong with them. Even as I followed my friends outside onto the schoolyard, I didn't join them in their small talk. I didn't even listen to it. "Yo, Earth to Steven. What do you think?" Eric suddenly asked, nudging me. "About what?" He sighed and pointed towards the eastern part of the school grounds. The entire eastern wing of the school building, as well as the gym, were still surrounded by a giant wrapped scaffold, cutting them off from the rest of the school grounds. "Stupid renovations," The additions to the gym building. I've been at it for what, like 2 months? 3? There's no progress at all. And I haven't seen the construction workers in weeks.
I nodded. He was right.
Man, it fucking sucks, Martin complained. We got a new season coming up, and all we have for weight training are these shitty equipment shacks. Yeah, if this continues, we're fucked.
As the two of them continued their rant, I stopped to stare at the massive construction area. Not that I cared about the gym or the new season, but I liked to hang out in the library. What the hell was taking them so long? Had the school run out of money? Once more, I rubbed my temples and noticed that the two of them had already made it to the other end of the schoolyard. When I set out after them, though, I almost bumped into a small Asian girl who'd approached me.
Sorry, I didn't mean to...
I started, but she cut me off.
I have to talk to you,
she whispered. With that, she got a hold of my arm and gave it the slightest pull. As I followed her around a corner, I couldn't help but wonder what she wanted from me. For a moment, an idea popped into my mind, but I discarded it right away.
So,
she started in a low, embarrassed voice, staring at her feet. Oh God, don't tell me this really was a confession.
I overheard you talking to your friends. It was about the teachers, right?
What? I asked, confused. Once more, she shifted around uncomfortably, trying her hardest to avoid my stare.
You said something was wrong with them, didn't you?
Wait a second. If this wasn't a confession, could it be she... Yeah, I finally said. I mean, I don't know what it is, but the way they talk and move, it's all slightly off.
Oh my God,
she blurted out, staring me in the eyes for the first time.
I thought I was the only one.
In a hushed whisper, I told the girl what I'd noticed about Mr. Thomas and some of the other teachers. She listened intently, but the moment I mentioned Mrs. Wolf, her eyes grew wide, and she cut me off.
It's her. I saw her one morning, but it was so weird.
One morning? What do you mean?
Sometimes I have trouble sleeping,
she admitted, mumbling.
So I'll go for runs in the early morning, long before anybody else gets up. About a month ago, I noticed her out there.
Wait, a month ago? I cut her off. That's way before I noticed anything about Mr. Thomas. She nodded.
It was so early, though, like 4:30 in the morning. The teachers never show up before 6. She was just standing there in the dark, not doing anything. There was something wrong with her face, but when I tried to figure out what it was, she just walked off into the darkness. The way she walked, it was so weird. I didn't understand what was going on. Like, why was she at school that early? And then they told us she'd not be at school for a few days, but I had definitely seen her.
Did you notice anything else about her afterwards? She shuffled around for a moment before she continued.
Well, she wasn't at school for a while, like we've been told. When she came back, though, I noticed how weird she was acting. Just like those other teachers you mentioned. After a while, though, she was back to normal. I don't know. I thought she really was sick, but after what you said, I'm...
Like, how can they all get sick and behave exactly the same? Damn it, I don't know what it is, but something is wrong with all of this. Her eyes grew wide at my outburst. I don't know. I tried talking to my friends, but none of them care. You're the first person who noticed anything.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Classes are starting. Go to your classroom, students.
I heard a strangely monotonous voice from behind us. When I turned around, I saw Miss Marks, our economics teacher. She was eyeing us with glassy, empty eyes, and walked in our direction. Another one, I thought. Yet another one.
Classes are starting. Do you need help finding your classroom?
No, we're fine, I blurted in an instant, barely able to keep my voice from cracking. With that, the two of us hurried away, each to our respective classrooms. After I'd suffered through 2 more hours of social studies, school was finally over for the day. I couldn't wait to get out of the building. On the surface, everything looked normal. But I knew something was wrong. Entirely wrong. I'd barely taken a step outside when the same Asian girl approached me. Without saying another word, she handed me a small note before she hurried away, clearly embarrassed about the whole ordeal. For a moment, I watched as she went on her way to the girls' dorm, before I opened the note. Written on it was her phone number and her name. Kim.
Now, how the hell did you do that?
Martin called out from behind me.
Man, why are you dating that gloomy Asian chick, though?
Eric cut in. Guys, shut up. It's not like that. They didn't, and kept pestering me the entire way to the dorm. They continued even after we made it to our room, trying to get something out of me. At first, I tried to reason with them, but eventually I just gave up and ignored their comments until they'd gotten ready for their first training session of the day. Once I had made sure they were gone, I added Kim's number and sent her a quick text, telling her it was me. It didn't take long before an answer arrived, in which she awkwardly thanked me for adding her. Man, what was it with this girl? We kept chatting for a bit longer, but her texts were short and to the point. It became apparent she knew little more than she'd already told me. The only thing I learned was that her last class had been biology with Mr. Wolfram, and he'd behaved just like the other strange teachers. Adding him to the rest meant that it was 5 teachers in total. That was almost a quarter of the entire staff, I realized, shivering. My thoughts were interrupted when my phone vibrated, telling me it was time for track and field. That day of the week again, I thought, as I half-heartedly packed my sports bag. I really wasn't in the mood for it. Hell, I had so many other more important things on my mind, but I knew I'd be in serious trouble if I didn't at least show up. As I ran, lap after lap, my head heavy with thought, the many implications came to mind. After only a handful of laps, I planted myself on a bench, panting, and ignored the frown Mr. Muller gave me. A few minutes later, I was joined by Eric, who was also part of the track and field team, among a handful of others.
Dude, what are you doing? Mr. Muller keeps staring at you. You should at least pretend to care.
What? Oh, yeah, I noticed him already, but with all the weird shit going on... Eric just gave me a, really? Look? For a moment, my eyes wandered over the rest of the school grounds. Nothing seemed amiss. The volleyball club was practicing nearby, and many other clubs had started on their respective activities.
Man, I hope we still aren't out here in winter,
Eric cursed, staring at the construction area. I looked over as well, but I didn't care about it. One person did care, however. Mr. Muller. When he came over, I could see the anger on his face. Eric quickly got up and started another lap, clearly trying to avoid becoming a target as well.
Now tell me, Stephen, how come you've been sitting on that bench for more than 10 minutes? Tell you what, boy, your performance is shit. I ought to send you back there and make you run until your legs fall off.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, Mr. Muller. I haven't been feeling well all this week. He couldn't help but shake his head at that.
I'd guess you haven't been feeling well this whole damn year.
Sorry. I'm going to try harder next week, I promise. He squinted his eyes. Sure you will, Stephen. By now, these types of talks had become the norm between us. He pretended to be mad, and I pretended to care. I could tell, however, that Mr. Muller didn't give a shit about my performance. I think his rants were just a way to keep up the facade and a play on authority. Once training was over, Eric sat in next to me as I made my way back to the dorms.
How the hell do you keep getting away with that? I was sure he'd tear you a new one.
I gave him a grin. Guess he knows I suck either way.
Trust me, bro. We all do.
With that, he started laughing, and soon was gone, on his way to his next training session, whatever it was. Back at the dorms, I kicked my sports bag under the bed and went to the computer right away. I had no clue what to search for, though. I looked up information on people behaving weirdly, moving mechanically, or being replaced by doppelgangers. In the end, I spent the entire evening reading through articles, forums, and Reddit posts, but found nothing useful. Eric and Martin returned late like they usually did, and after some goofing around, left me to my own devices, and spent what little remained of the evening in the common room. After they'd gone to bed, I continued to stay up, hidden in my little corner of the room, and continued my research on the internet. Half the results were about mental illness and depression, the rest even less helpful. I read articles about aliens, robots, and even frickin' reptilians. When I stumbled upon yet another review of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, long past midnight, I closed my browser in frustration and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I felt utterly exhausted. Even worse, a feeling of anxiety washed over me at the mere thought of going to school. For a moment, I considered hiding in my dorm room, but I knew it wouldn't do a thing. Mrs. Richter would make sure to chase me to school if she had to. The moment I entered the building, it felt different. Dangerous, even. It was an almost feasible sensation, as if someone or something could come for me at any moment. As I walked down the hallway, on my way to my first class, I couldn't help but watch every single teacher I saw. Yet, I noticed something. To my surprise, Miss Marks and Mr. Thomas seemed to be back to normal. There was no hint of their strange mechanical movements anymore, and their expressions seemed as genuine as they'd always been. Almost. When I watched them more closely, an ominous feeling washed over me. One I couldn't shake off. And after a few more seconds, I knew what it was. It was their eyes. Their faces. Small, minute details were still wrong. Their faces lacked emotion. Their eyes were glassy and half empty. And whenever they spoke, I saw the corners of their mouths twitch slightly. Barely noticeably. Suddenly, another thought popped into my mind, as I remembered what Kim had told me about Mrs. Wolf. What if they hadn't been sick at all? What if whatever had replaced them had just gotten better at pretending? My third class of the day was math, with none other than Mr. Flack. The same icy feeling of apprehension came over me as he entered. My eyes rested on him as he walked to his desk. For a moment, everything about him seemed normal. But when he began speaking, I noticed the same barely noticeable twitching in the corners of his mouth. In a monotonous voice, he explained today's class was reserved for preparations for the upcoming math exam. As groans filled the room, he began distributing worksheets, and told us to solve them on our own. At the end of class, if there was still enough time, we'd go through them together. Once everyone had their worksheets, he spoke up again.
There's something else I want to talk with you all about.
I looked up. What now?
In the next couple of weeks, we'll have a great opportunity for our more academically gifted students. We're organizing a field trip to some of the nearby colleges and universities. In the coming days, we're going to discuss the details with you in case you're chosen, such as programs and schools you consider attending after your graduation from Miller's Academy. For this reason, you'll most likely be excused for the rest of the day to take care of the mandatory paperwork.
I couldn't help but wonder where the hell this was coming from. A field trip to universities and colleges? For the academically gifted students? This school had never given a shit about academics before. This didn't add up, not at all. Somehow, I knew this had to be related to whatever was going on. I wasn't the only one who was confused, though. Daniel, our math ace, raised his hand. Mr. Flack nodded, signaling him to speak.
I've got a question. What's the reason for this trip?
Well, given the school's ongoing renovations, we're planning on broadening the school's focus,
Mr. Flack continued.
With the new facilities being added to the school's eastern wing, we'll be able to introduce new programs focusing on math and STEM. We'll also be introducing a new scholarship, solely for academically gifted students.
The moment these words left his mouth, I could hear the laughter of the jocks. Eric was one of them. A few even demanded he tell them what was up with this bullshit. Mr. Flack ignored them and didn't even look at them.
Start doing your exercises, students,
he said, and with that, the issue was settled. I pretended to start, but in reality, I kept my eyes trained on Mr. Flack. People were murmuring all around me, and he didn't seem to care if we were doing our exercises. Instead, he was busy going through the class register. Minute after minute passed while he studied it meticulously. His face was without emotions as he did, and I wondered if he'd spaced out or stopped working. Then he looked up, and for a panicked second I was afraid he'd notice how intently I'd been watching him. Then his eyes darted towards Daniel. A moment later, he got up, approached him, and whispered something into his ear. As much as I strained myself to hear, I couldn't understand a word under the general noise of the classroom. I saw Daniel nod a few times before he gathered up his things, got up, and made his way to the front of the class. After that, Mr. Flack repeated the same ordeal with another girl in class, Nicole, who was the second best math student in class. Finally, he joined the two of them and led them outside. Before he left, he turned back to the rest of the class once more.
Keep working on your exercises, students.
Then he was gone, Daniel and Nicole in tow. Right away, everyone began discussing the field trip and the announcement of the new scholarship. I sat quietly, staring at Daniel and Nicole's empty seats with a growing feeling of apprehension. No, this entire thing sounded more than fishy. Suddenly, a crumpled up ball of paper hit me. When I turned around, I found Eric grinning at me.
You know what's up with that?
He called out. One of his jock friends, Tom, turned to me as well.
Yeah, nerd, spill the beans. I'm sure you know more than us.
God, I hated Tom. No clue. First time I'm hearing about this, I answered, shrugging. Tom called out once more, but I ignored him. He and the rest were right about one thing, though. How had no one heard about this? The whole thing wasn't too far-fetched. It just didn't make sense for a school like Miller's Academy. What made it even weirder was the way they had announced it. Usually they'd make a big deal out of it, organize an assembly or even a parent-teacher conference. Instead, they announced it so casually, in the middle of the semester at that. No. This was no mere field trip. This had to be related to what was happening with the teachers. Was it some sort of ploy? But for what? Shit, I was losing it, and soon felt panic rising inside of me. I told myself to calm down, to take a deep breath. But again and again, my eyes wandered to the two empty seats in class. Where the hell had he taken them? Eventually, I couldn't sit still anymore. I got up and made my way to the door. Somehow, I had to figure out what was going on. I cracked open the door to peek outside and almost collided with Mr. Flack, who was returning to class. Alone.
What's the matter?
He asked. Oh, it's nothing, I rambled. I thought I heard something from outside, so... He just looked at me. And for a moment, his half-empty eyes became a tad bit more focused, almost as if he was probing me. Then he spoke up again.
Back to your seat. Keep working on your exercises.
Where are Daniel and Nicole? I blurted out.
Discussing the details of the field trip. Keep working on your exercises.
His voice hadn't changed. It was as monotonous as before, but his eyes had grown a tad bit wider, and I noticed that the corners of his mouth were twitching more noticeably. I held his gaze for another second before I couldn't take it anymore, and hurried back to my seat. A few minutes later, I got a text from Kim. Hey, did the teacher take anyone in your class to discuss the details of some field trip? Yes, 2, Daniel and Nicole. 1 here, Andrea. This is just too weird. It's gotta be related to whatever's going on. Teacher saw my phone. Talk to you later. I put my phone away as well and focused on Mr. Flack again. He was busy wandering the classroom, looking at everyone's progress. At least, that's what he was pretending to do. I noticed how he went from student to student, mumbling a few words here and there, but he never actually looked at the worksheets. He was just staring ahead at nothing. When class ended, Mr. Flack announced we'd discuss the solution during our next class. Yeah, right, I thought. It was clear he didn't give a shit about them, and they'd been nothing but a tool to keep us busy. After he'd said this, he packed up his things and left the classroom without another word. Everyone leaned back in their seats or went outside to linger in the hallways. I still couldn't help but stare at Daniel and Nicole's empty seats. Eventually, I left the room as well. It felt oppressive to just sit there and see their empty seats in front of me. Once I was outside, I walked up to Eric. Hey man, have you seen Daniel and Nicole? They aren't back yet, are they?
No shit, Sherlock. Look, they probably sent him home early,
he said, annoyed, and turned his attention back to the group of girls he'd been ogling. What if they didn't? Where do you think Mr. Flack took them? How the hell would I know? Maybe the teacher's lounge or the principal's office? Why are you asking me? If you want to go on that stupid field trip so much, just ask a teacher. What? No, I don't want to go on that damn field trip. Listen, man, you remember what I've been talking about, right? What if this field trip's related to it? And, I don't know, they were taken somewhere else. Yeah, by the weird teachers, right? He said sarcastically. Aw, shit, man, they left. He suddenly cursed, most likely referring to the girls. Instead of saying anything else, I sighed and walked off. How in the hell did he not notice how weird all of this was? I told him and Martin what I'd seen, what I thought was going on, and they just ignored all of it. As I turned toward him, though, and watched him joke with his friends, I got my answer. None of them gave a shit about the regular classes or the teachers, for that matter. Hell, their entire days were filled to the brim with training regimens and practices. Eric and Martin always complained about how their football coach was working them to the bone because of the upcoming season. Yet, I knew for a fact that they'd pass their classes either way, be it with a little help from administrators or their parents' wallet. They were only here for the sports, to attend their clubs and the hopes of landing a sports scholarship. That's the type of school this was, after all. The only ones who would notice something was wrong were the students who actually paid attention during class. The ones like me and Kim. Or Daniel and Nicole, I realized. Was this the reason for the supposed field trip? Were they trying to get rid of the students who would notice something was wrong? What about me, then? Wouldn't I be invited as well? And what should I do if I was? Another surge of panic washed over me, and for a moment I had to take a deep breath to calm myself down. My next class felt like an eternity. These new thoughts, however outlandish they were, lingered on my mind and began to fester. Jesus Christ, I cursed out loud and instantly got a few curious stares from the students around me. The moment lunch break arrived, I made my way outside into the schoolyard right away. I couldn't stand being inside that building anymore. Couldn't pretend everything was normal. For a moment, I considered running off to get back to the dorms and hide. But what would happen then? Wouldn't it tell whoever was behind it all that I knew? Instead, I forced myself to sit on a bench, waiting and keeping my eyes open for Kim. I had to talk to her. When she finally appeared, I rushed up to her. "We need to talk," I blurted, and without waiting for a reply, got a hold of her arm and dragged her around a corner. Eric was nearby, of course, and so was Martin. When they noticed us, they whistled at us from afar, and even threw a few comments our way. I could see Kim blushing, trying her best to hide herself from view. God, those idiots. You said someone from your class was invited on the field trip as well, right? She nodded, but said nothing. Alright, I think I know what they're trying to do. I know this might sound crazy, but listen, alright? With that, I reiterated my idea of the teachers wanting to get rid of anyone who could notice their strange behavior. No, I don't think that's it. Kim started. I could tell the erratic tone of my voice scared her. Wait, what do you mean? Andrea's back already. She left school and returned to the dorms with a stack of paperwork. I felt the tension I'd been under give way, and sighed with relief. Alright, I guess that means She was acting strange, though. Kim cut me off. What do you mean? She didn't talk to anyone. Sure, they excused her for the rest of the day, but she said nothing about the field trip. She just packed up her stuff and said she had things to take care of. She was distant, almost stunned. Emotionless. You think they did something to her? I don't know. This is all way too strange. Maybe she got some bad news or can't get into the school of her choice. I mean, she's always talking about wanting to go to... Come on, man, kiss her already. Martin suddenly called out from nearby. I noticed him and Eric staring at me and Kim with wide grins on their faces. Yeah, go for it, Steven, Eric yelled as well. Kim's face turned bright red, and in an instant she cringed back. I think I better get going, she mumbled, staring at her feet. I'll text you later. With that, she hurried away. Hey, I called after her, but she didn't react. God damn it! I cursed out loud. What the hell are you two idiots doing? I screamed at the two of them while they laughed their asses off. Dude, Eric started, but couldn't go on because he had to catch his breath for a second. You gotta go for it. Yeah, Martin started, putting his arm around my shoulder. You can't just let her walk away like that. You're supposed to go after her. In an instant, I freed myself from his arm. I'm not fucking dating her, alright? I'm just talking to her about the strange shit that none of you idiots even notice. Yeah, the teacher's becoming robot aliens, Eric said, still laughing. Man, you two are a great match, Martin continued. You're both into stupid conspiracy theories. With that, the two of them burst out laughing again. Seriously, guys? Don't you find any of this strange? The way the teachers act, the new scholarship, that damn field trip? Yeah, field trip. Super scary. Never happened at this school before, Eric said, rolling his eyes. Freaking hell, guys. I cursed in sheer frustration. When I tried to walk off, they continued to make silly comments and stumbled around me like robots. Boop, beep, boop. Look at me, boop, beep. I'm a robot, Eric said in a fake robot voice. We will, beep, get you, beep, to join the field trip, Martin added in. I tried to ignore their newest antics, but with each second I grew angrier at them. Before I could snap back at them, however, the bell announced the end of lunch break, and everyone began making their way inside. Suddenly I saw Daniel nearby. He was making his way down the hallway, holding a stack of paperwork, most likely on his way to the dorms. I rushed up to him. Daniel, how'd it go? Any news on the field trip? Good, he said. What the hell did they talk to you about? You were gone for hours.
The field trip,
he said, matter-of-factly.
I've got to take care of the paperwork, though.
With that, he simply continued down the hallway. Yo, Daniel, stop, I called after him. Just tell me what's going on here? I suddenly heard the loud, stern voice of our political science teacher, Mr. Hubert, from behind me. Class is about to start, Stephen. Back to your seat. I was about to complain, to yell at him, but under his stern, scrutinizing gaze, I couldn't do anything but back down. I cursed at myself, but made my way back to the classroom. For a second, however, I looked over my shoulder and noticed how weird Daniel's posture was. Back in my seat, I was more than confused about the way Daniel had acted. What the hell was the matter with him? Why didn't he just tell me what they talked to him about? Then, slowly, another thought came to mind. I told myself I was being crazy, but I couldn't shake it off. No matter how much I tried. What if the same thing had happened to him that had happened to the teachers? Mr. Hubert's class was my last for the day, but it seemed to stretch on for an eternity. My mind was in an uproar, and more than once I had to tell myself to calm down. When the bell finally rang, I threw my things into my backpack and hurried out of the school. No, I escaped from it. This newest revelation was enough to push me into a state of near panic. What the hell was happening at this school? My eyes wandered over the other students on their way back to the dorm. Yet, all of them were acting normal. They were joking and chatting as usual. None of them showed any of the weird behavior I'd seen from the teachers, or Daniel for that matter. Then it clicked. They'd sent the chosen students home early, supposedly to take care of the paperwork for the field trip. Was it so no one would notice what had happened to them? The moment I entered the dorm building, I did something I never did. I entered the common room, took a seat at a table, and pretended to sort through my school bag. All the while, however, I did my best to watch the other students. None of them were behaving strangely, and nothing seemed amiss. Eventually, not sure what to make of all this, I went back to my room. When I entered, I saw Eric and Martin were nowhere to be seen, and figured they must have left for training already. In an instant, I booted up the computer and checked out the school's official website. It would be big news if they were really planning on changing the school's focus and establishing this new scholarship. It should be all over the page. Yet I found nothing in the site's news section. All I found were pictures of sports teams, events, and information on the athletic scholarship. Hell, apart from the pictures, it looked like the site hadn't been updated in years. I leaned back in frustration before taking out my phone. Within moments, I sent Kim another message, apologizing for my stupid friends, telling her how Daniel behaved and asking if she had seen any other students who were sent home early. Her answer was short and to the point, as always. She told me she'd seen no one else. Yet she also said she hadn't tried to and was trying her best not to attract any attention. When I read this, I remembered my interaction with Daniel. If he was now a part of whatever was going on, wouldn't he inform whoever was responsible about my snooping around? Shit, you stupid idiot! Fear washed over me and my eyes darted to the door. No, calm down. You just asked him how the talk about the field trip went, nothing else. You're nothing but a curious student wanting to know more about it, that's all. A moment later, however, I couldn't fight my fear anymore, and went to the door again. I cracked it open to check out in the hallway, half expecting to find Daniel spying on me. Or worse, lying in wait for me. The hallway was clear, however. I still didn't feel safe, and in an instant I locked the door behind me. Before long, I searched for information online again, but found nothing substantial. I told a few people on Discord about what was going on, but they weren't helpful. They were shitposting or taking my story as nothing but a silly attempt at a joke. Someone even called me out for trying to start some shitty ARG. As the hours went by, I also posted on Reddit and other forums. The result was the same. One commenter mentioned that mRNA vaccines might alter other people's behavior, but it was nothing but a conspiracy theory. The rest was even less helpful, filled with movie references or jokes about pod people. When I searched for something that could replace people, or teachers specifically, the results were fictional stories or discussions about AI. As I read on, I realized that quite a few people wondered if large language models would replace real teachers in the future. I clicked from article to article, from discussion to discussion, and read a bit here and there. I was about to give up when I actually started thinking about it. The teachers' behavior, their way of moving and talking, they'd all walked in this strange, mechanical, almost robot-like fashion. Then I remembered their monotonous way of speaking, and their empty eyes. Could this be what was going on here? What if this was some sort of crazy pilot project? But who would do something like that? And why? Most importantly, though, how? Alright, no, stop. This is insane. Teachers being replaced by robots? For what? To improve the school's record and get funding? A voice in my head said. Then I almost laughed. Almost. I thought about the ongoing construction, and the renovations of the Eastern Wing, about the strange new scholarship and the field trip. Could the school administration be behind the entire thing? No, that makes no sense. Even if, why would they do the same thing to the students? Yet, only a few minutes later, I picked up my phone and sent Kim another message. I rewrote it several times before I hit send. It didn't take long before she read my rant about robots and AI. She began typing once, twice, but never replied. I couldn't blame her. For all I knew, she might think I snapped. I kept waiting for a reply before I began typing another message, trying to explain myself. Suddenly, I heard someone tinkering with the door before loud knocks followed. I jerked up and almost crashed off my chair. For a moment, I stared at the door anxiously, half expecting Daniel to come for me. "Hey, idiot, what the hell's wrong with you? Open the door." I heard Eric's familiar voice calling out to me. I took one look at the clock and saw it was long past 10 in the evening. In my obsession to figure out what was going on, I'd completely forgotten about him and Martin. God, I wasn't in the mood to be ridiculed by them. "The hell are you doing in there?" Martin joined in. "You thinking about that Asian chick or something? Yo, open up." With a sigh, I got up and unlocked the door. Before I could so much as say another word, or apologize for locking them out, the two of them pushed themselves right past me and entered the room. "Why'd you lock the door, man?" Eric laid into me. "Were you watching porn?" Martin asked, snickering. A second later, he flopped down on my bed and eyed the still open article on my computer.
Dude, what the hell were you even looking at?
Nothing, I said, and minimized the browser.
The hell was that? Like some sort of weird porn?
Eric asked, grinning, and already made his way towards the computer as well.
Nah, just an article about robots or something,
Martin said, laughing. I sighed.
So, how are things going?
Eric asked, turning to me.
What do you mean? The Asian chick, idiot.
I rolled my eyes. I told you guys I'm not dating her.
Well, duh, but we're here to help with that.
What the hell does that even mean? I'm not interested in...
All right, dude,
Martin started.
You've been spending the past week doing nothing but sitting in this room, thinking about robots and stuff, right? And conspiracies about teachers,
Eric added. Before I could react, Martin maximized my browser again and began reading the last article I'd opened.
Here, listen to this. Given our current educational crisis, the emergence of AI might...
Just get away from my computer. I pushed Martin off my bed and closed the browser for good.
It's because you're reading all those weird books,
Eric said, pointing at my bookshelf. Maybe you should give reading a try. You might learn a thing or two, I said, grinning at him.
Not bad, dude. Not bad,
Martin said, laughing.
Now look, here's the plan. We're going to sneak out. And by we, I mean you, Martin, and me.
Eric started.
Cindy's waiting for him by the girls' dorm. She's going to let us in.
I just stared at him. What the hell were these idiots going on about? There was God knows what going on here, and all they thought about were girls, and sneaking out in the middle of the night. Are you guys serious? Do you have any idea?
Yes, we're serious, Martin said. Maybe we could even have... What's her name? Come along.
Kim? I mean, what? If Mrs. Richter notices, you guys are in deep shit.
Nah, she's probably asleep by now anyway.
Yeah, but what if she's...
Jesus Christ, man. Will you lighten up for once? When was the last time you even left this stupid room and hung out with anyone?
Well, I've been to track, I started, but my voice trailed off when I saw them roll their eyes. I sighed. They were right about one thing. For the past week, I'd been thinking about nothing but the school, the teachers, and what was going on. All of this was getting to me. But how the hell could it not? Then I started to think. If I snuck out and we'd be able to meet up with Kim, then maybe we could talk about it. Hell, maybe we'd even be able to convince these idiots that something very wrong was going on.
I even brought a couple of those,
Eric said suddenly, pulling out 2 six-packs he'd hidden under the bed. How in the hell did you even get those? I asked. Eric gave me a wide grin. He started on about a complicated, over-the-top story I could tell was bullshit, when Martin sighed.
Remember Robert Newman? He's the one who taught us how to sneak in booze, that's all.
While Eric grumbled something, I thought about Robert. He'd been the biggest troublemaker in school. He always snuck out at night, terrorized the girls' dorm, and even ran his own little black market, selling booze and cigarettes. The guy had been an absolute legend. At least, until they kicked him out. While the two of them were busy packing the beer into Eric's backpack, I sighed.
All right, what are we waiting for?
The two of them grinned, and a few minutes later, we carefully pushed open the window and made our way outside. As we began sneaking around the dorm building, I couldn't help but frown. What in the hell was I even doing? How did I always let them drag me into things?
All right, Cindy's room is at the end of the girls' dorm. She told me to knock on the window twice and she'll let us in,
Martin explained in a hushed whisper. Eric and I nodded. We made our way from the dorm toward the school building, then past it, and finally reached the girls' dorm. The moment we rounded a corner, however, a flashlight focused in on us.
Who are you? What do you think you're doing out here in the middle of the night?
A deep male voice called out to us.
Shit, it's Mr. Siegert.
In an instant, the three of us booked it and ran from the building. The old security guard called after us, but he was way too slow. Before he could so much as start after us, we'd already left him behind. Instead of running back to the dorm, however, Eric and Martin ran straight to the nearby football field. Once there, we dashed for a bleacher and hid ourselves under it. It wasn't much in the way of security, but Mr. Siegert was still way too far off. The two of them couldn't help but giggle when they noticed his figure stumbling around nearby. his flashlight darting here and there, but staying clear of the bleacher. While my friends were barely containing their laughter, I watched the old man. As far as I could tell, there was no sign of strange mechanical movements, and his grumbled curses were anything but monotonous. Eventually, he seemed to give up, and made his way towards the boys' dorm, where he most likely thought we'd run off to.
Shit, why'd we have to run into him? Especially tonight,
Martin cursed. He took out his phone and started typing furiously. It didn't take long before a reply arrived. It was obvious he was texting with Cindy.
Hey, tell her to bring Melanie along,
Eric cut in. Martin sighed but nodded.
Oh yeah, and that Asian chick Steven's into, Kim, right?
Yeah, tell her she's got to bring her, I added, earning a bright grin from Eric. I'd only come along to talk to Kim, and hopefully convince the rest of them together. If she didn't show up, this entire thing was meaningless.
All right, I told her, Melanie and Kim. How come you're suddenly so eager about her coming?
Martin asked, nudging me. I sighed, but said nothing.
Probably thinks he can make out with her. Isn't that right, Steven? I mean, just think about her cute little...
How about you just hand me one of those? I cut him off, pointing at the backpack. By now, I was sick and tired of their goddamn jokes. The two of them, however, continued laughing. A moment later, Eric threw me a can, opened one himself, and handed another to Martin. Together, the three of us sat there, drinking our beer. Every once in a while, Martin would check his phone, or he'd get up and scan the area, looking for a sign of Cindy. As I sat there, below the bleacher, I tried my best to feel calm, but my thoughts lingered on the same topic they had for weeks. While Eric and Martin talked about the girls, I tried to come up with a way, any way, for Kim and me to explain what was going on. My thoughts were cut short when Martin pointed at someone nearby. At first, I thought it was Mr. Siegert, who was still searching for us, but then I noticed the long hair and slender figure. In an instant, Martin revealed himself and signaled for Cindy to come over.
Damn, I thought you wouldn't come anymore, babe,
Martin said to Cindy, and the moment she reached us, he put his arms around her.
Hey, Melanie,
Eric mumbled when he noticed the second girl following Cindy, his voice more nervous than ever before. I waited, but no one else followed them. Shit, don't tell me. What about Kim? I asked. Cindy looked over at me and sighed. To be honest, I didn't even know who you guys were talking about, but Melanie said she knew her. I don't know her, Melanie started, rolling her eyes. I just know there's this weird Asian girl at the dorms who's always by herself. There's no way she'd be up for something like this, though. Eric laughed at that.
Man, did you hear that? She's always by herself. You two are made for each other.
God damn it, man, shut up. At that, the girls giggled. Well, they would make quite the couple, Cindy added. I cursed myself, but said nothing. Then I thought about what to tell them. Without Kim backing me up, what could I even do? Eric and Martin would simply ridicule me, and I was sure the girls would join in. God damn it, why the hell did I even come along? How could I have thought that Kim would be the type to sneak out in the middle of the night? Man, I was such an idiot. Minute after minute passed, but I couldn't come up with anything. Eventually, I just finished my beer in frustration and soon asked Eric for a second one. Suddenly, Martin turned towards the scaffold of the construction area.
Bet the view from up there is amazing,
he mumbled. Eric and I both turned to him. He was right. You could probably see the entire school grounds from the highest level. But climbing up there in the middle of the night? What was he thinking? Oh, don't you... Cindy started, but Eric cut her off.
Bet you don't have the balls to go up there,
he called out. Martin grinned at him.
Oh, it's so on, dude.
Before anyone could say anything, he jumped to his feet and set out towards the construction area. God, you idiot, Cindy cursed and set out after him. A moment later, Eric, Melanie, and I followed them. By that point, Cindy had already reached him, and I could hear her argue with Martin. But after a few seconds, she gave up. I watched as Martin climbed onto the first level of the scaffold. He'd never cared much about such silly things as danger. As he continued on his way up, a nervous-looking Cindy watched from below. Yo, be careful, I called out.
And who do we have here?
Mr. Siegert's voice reached us. When I turned around, the beam of his flashlight hit me straight in the face. Oh, shit, I cursed. and was about to run when he spoke up again.
"You better not try anything, Schmidt," he addressed me. "Same goes for you, Brant."
When Eric and I heard our names, we stopped. One look around showed me that Melanie must have booked it. The old man, however, seemed more than satisfied having caught the two of us.
"Well, boys, guess you're not so quick now. Tell you what, personally, I don't care if you drink or hang out, but this is a school, and we got rules, you got that?"
We both nodded.
"Now then, I'm gonna let it slide tonight, so you head back to your dorm and get some sleep. Next time I catch you drinking out here, I'll have a good long talk with Mrs. Wolf about it."
Once more, we nodded. I turned around towards the scaffold, but Martin was nowhere to be seen, and neither was Cindy. They were probably hiding, watching the entire thing.
"I can't believe this," I mumbled to myself. "What was that, Schmidt?"
"Nothing." Eric and I had barely taken a few steps when Mr. Siegert spoke up again.
"Oh, and Brant, I'll be taking the rest of those," he said, pointing at Eric's backpack.
Eric's eyes widened, and for a moment a look of utter despair crossed his face when the old man rummaged through his backpack. While Mr. Siegert collected the remaining cans, I heard something. It had to be Martin, I thought. But he was up there, watching and laughing his ass off. Then I heard it again. It didn't sound like the rattling of the scaffold. It was different, more distant, and sounded more like digging? What the hell?
"Now then, boys, back to your room."
With that, the old man gave us a push. As we stumbled towards the boys' dorm, the glimmer of his flashlight was our constant companion. When we reached it, the old man sighed.
"How about we don't wake up Mrs. Richter and you get back in the way you left?
But," he said, his eyes focusing on us,
"as I said, tonight's an exception."
We both nodded again and climbed back inside via the window. He gave us one last look before he set out to continue his nightly routine. The moment he was gone, and Eric had thrown the window shut, he cursed in frustration.
"Bet the old bastard took the beer just to drink it himself. Did you see how his eyes lit up when he took the cans?"
"What? No, I didn't," I answered, staring out the window in the direction of the construction site.
"Yo, Steven, what's the matter?"
Eric asked, suddenly pulling out 2 more cans from God knows where. "How?" was all I managed to ask. He shrugged and pointed at a third six-pack he had stored under the bed.
"You always gotta have a backup plan. You never know what might happen."
I couldn't help but shake my head. But when he offered me a can, I took it. What did it even matter? After a few more sips, however, I went back to the window.
"Where the hell is he?"
"Who?" "Who do you think? Martin. Shouldn't he be back by now?" Eric shrugged.
"He's probably afraid he'll get in trouble as well. Bet he's gonna wait there until tomorrow morning."
Well, he had a point. That sounded just like him. Those weird noises, however? In the end, we finished 2 more cans of beer before we called it a night. By that point, I was pretty drunk. Eric was already asleep, and I soon slumped down on my bed as well. I didn't know how late it was, but it felt like long past midnight. It felt like I'd barely closed my eyes when my phone alarm woke me. At first, I didn't know where I was or what was going on. Moments later, I felt a splitting headache. I groaned, turned off the alarm, and lay in bed, staring at the slowly spinning ceiling. Fricking Eric. Fricking Martin. And frickin' beer. God, I felt like absolute shit. One look around showed me my friends were nowhere to be seen, and had probably left for morning training already. For a moment, I just lay there. Then I closed my eyes again. There was no way I'd be able to get up or, hell, go to school today. 10 minutes later, loud knocks from the door sent jolt after jolt of pain through my head. "What the hell?" I called out. A second later, the door burst open, and I was greeted by a furious Mrs. Richter. "Steven, get up! It's time for class!" she called out. I mumbled something, rubbed my temples, and curled up under the blanket. "Now what's the matter with you? Everyone's leaving for school already."
"Sorry, I'm not feeling well. I think I might be sick."
The dorm mother wouldn't have any of it. I'm not going to repeat myself. Get up, now. I cursed under my breath and stumbled out of bed. When she saw the state I was in, her frown deepened. It soon changed into a knowing smile when she noticed the deep circles under my eyes, and the empty beer cans that still littered the floor. See, Stephen? That's much better.
Seriously, Miss Richter? I feel like absolute shit. Can I just stay in my room today, please?
Nonsense, Stephen, she said. Class is important. If you aren't dying, you're going to class. She gave me a quick once-over, then nodded to herself. Doesn't look like you're dying. Keep going, Stephen. I groaned, but made my way to the bathroom. As I stumbled to school, I cursed on myself once more for having gone along with Eric and Martin. Why the hell did I always join them in their stupid shenanigans? The moment I got closer to the school building, I saw Mr. Flack inside. When I noticed his wide, half-empty eyes, reality came crashing down on me, and I was flooded with anxiety. Because I'd felt so bad, I'd completely forgotten about what was going on at the school. I thought about going back, to run, to hide, to do anything but enter that goddamn building. But my head was still spinning, and I almost stumbled over my feet. No, there was no way I'd be able to get away or outrun anyone right now. Instead, I tried my best to ignore the teacher's probing eyes and entered the building. For my first 2 classes, I tried my best to stay under everyone's radar. I lay on my desk, barely listening, and watched the teacher's mechanical movements, half in a trance. My head was still a throbbing, pained mess. My 3rd class was history, but I looked up when Mr. Hubert entered.
Morning, class. Sorry to inform you, but Mr. Schubert isn't doing well today, so I'm going to be taking over history.
In an instant, groans filled the classroom, but were quieted by one of the man's stern glances. From his reaction, I realized Mr. Hubert was still himself. Because of this, however, it didn't take him long to notice the state I was in.
What's the matter with you, Stephen?
He called out shortly after he'd started the class. I saw Eric out of the corner of my eye, barely able to contain his laughter.
I'm not feeling well today,
I mumbled as an answer.
You sure look it,
he said.
You want me to take you to the nurse's office?
I looked up and nodded. Maybe this was my chance of getting out of here. I gathered my things as quickly as I could and let him lead me outside. I didn't care what everyone was thinking. Out in the hallway, the man's eyes focused on me again.
Well, Stephen,
he started.
I heard a little rumor. Apparently some boys snuck out last night to get drunk. Pretty sure it's nothing but nonsense, though, right?
Yeah, probably, I mumbled.
I hope so. Should those rumors prove true, those boys would be in a lot of trouble.
Once more, he eyed me curiously, but I simply nodded. It was clear he knew that I'd been one of them, and it was clear he was giving me a warning.
Guess you got the stomach flu, though. Heard it makes the rounds these days. Well, here you go.
With that, he left me standing in front of the nurse's office, and made his way back to class. For a few moments, I watched him walk off. Then I put my hand on the door handle and opened it.
I'm not sick. I'm telling you, something's wrong.
It was Mr. Schubert. The old man's voice was erratic, high-pitched, and close to cracking.
I don't know what you're talking about, Frank. Everything is completely normal,
the nurse said. Her voice was usually soothing and comforting, but I noticed how monotonous and hollow it sounded, how stretched out each of her vowels was. I froze, standing in the open door, not able to do anything but watch what was going on inside.
But that's not Marcus. I've known him for almost a decade, and he'd never...
He protested, but was cut off.
Mr. Thomas is having some private issues at the moment. It's nothing you should be worried about.
With that, the nurse pushed the old man back onto the bedside, holding him in place. Those words, I'd heard them before. They were almost the same as those Mrs. Wolfe had said to me. All the while, the old man continued to argue, but once more he couldn't continue. Suddenly, I heard him gasp, and the strangest of sounds escaped from his mouth. What the hell was she doing to him? I watched as she held the struggling old man in place, and pushed one of her hands down his throat.
What the fuck?
I blurted out in shock. Instantly, the nurse's head jerked around. Her wide eyes came to rest on me.
What now?
She snapped at me. I cringed back in shock, stumbled over my own feet, and almost crashed to the floor before I booked it down the hallway. It had been her head. Only her head had moved. And it had twisted in a 180-degree angle.
Just what the... What are you doing here, Stephen?
A voice suddenly called out to me. It was a shrill one, but one I recognized right away. When I turned around, I found none other than Mrs. Wolf staring at me. A second later, she began walking towards me. With each step, her eyes grew wider. As I watched her approaching me, fear washed over me. No, I couldn't be caught by her. Not here, not now, not ever.
Classes are in session, Stephen,
she called out to me once more. This time, her voice sounded different. Too high. Almost distorted. A mockery of her usual one. I watched as her mouth turned into a hard line, as her hands opened and closed in anticipation. When I couldn't take it anymore, I jerked around and rushed towards the school's front door. I didn't turn around, but I could hear her coming after me, could feel her eyes digging into my back, and could almost feel her hands reaching out for me. Moments later, I was outside. My head was spinning, but I didn't stop until I made it halfway to the dorm. When I finally stopped, my heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt close to retching. When I looked over my shoulder, I saw her standing in the school's front door, staring after me. Her head was strangely crooked, and with each passing second, she seemed to crooked a tad bit more. In an instant, I turned around and continued on. When Mrs. Richter saw me, she frowned, and was about to get up.
The nurse sent me home,
I lied.
Stomach flu.
Before she could stop me, or even say anything, I pushed myself past her. This time, she didn't follow me, but I heard her sigh audibly. Once I was back in my room, I threw myself onto my bed. The splitting headache was still there, now worse because of the exertion of running from school. Yet it only took a few moments before I dozed off. It was already afternoon when Eric woke me by barging into the room. The moment he saw the state I was in, he laughed his ass off.
Man, a lightweight like you should have gone easy on the beer.
Yeah, and whose fault is that? I retorted, annoyed.
Definitely not mine. I didn't force you to do anything.
Yeah, right.
Come on, dude, I'm feeling like shit.
Then I remembered Martin. Hey, what about Martin? Is he back yet?
Nah, didn't see him during morning training. And he wasn't at school. Cindy, neither. I bet the two of them skipped school and went down to Willow Grove again.
Dude, how can you be so calm? What if something happened to them? There's all this weird shit going on. The teachers, the field trip.
Speaking of the field trip,
he cut me off.
I got great news for you. You got invited, nerd.
Wait, what?
Guess you're Mr. Thomas's favorite after all. You're the only one he mentioned during physics class. But given how buddy-buddy you two are, it's no surprise.
Shit, I cursed. When Eric heard this, he raised his eyebrows.
Thought you'd be excited about it.
Why would I be?
Dude, you got all these stupid books here? Constantly hang out with them. So I thought,
fuck, man, don't you get what's going on? When he heard that, Eric rolled his eyes.
Alright, dude. I'm not gonna listen to any more of that shit. Either way, I gotta go. Football training's coming up. Not everyone can be hungover all day.
With that, he turned around and left the room. Oh, fuck off, I called after him. Once he was gone, I took out my phone and noticed I'd gotten 2 messages from Kim. One around noon, and the other just about an hour ago. 2 more students were just invited to that weird field trip. Hey, why aren't you answering? Are you okay? Shit, I thought when I saw them. Given that I'd not replied, she probably thought something had happened to me. Then I remembered what Eric had told me. It would have if I hadn't left school early. Sorry, I didn't feel well and I snuck out. I hit send, but the message wasn't delivered. I stared at it, waiting. Then I closed the app and reopened it. Still the same. Only after a minute was my short message delivered. I waited for Kim to read it, to react to it, but nothing happened. Shit, what was going on? Minute after minute passed, until I was finally notified I'd received a message from her. Thank God you're okay. I wasn't sure what was going on since there's trouble with my phone connection. I stared at her message. Trouble with her phone's connection? Don't tell me. I typed out an answer, telling her my connection was acting up too. Once again, long minutes passed before her reply arrived. It was short and to the point as usual. She told me she'd had trouble with her phone all day, sent me her email address, and told me to hit her up via the school's internet chat. She'd get back to me once she was back at the dorms. The school's intranet chat? What the hell was she talking about? Then I remembered. Back in the day, when there was almost no signal out here, Miller's Academy had set up an internal chat client via the school's intranet, so students could stay in contact with one another. I'd never used it, though, and I was almost sure no one even knew it existed. I logged into the student's intranet, and after some searching around, I finally found the chat client. The interface was horrendously dated, but after a little while I figured out how to use it, and sent Kim a chat request. I stared at it, waiting. Kim had said she'd get back to me once she was back in her dorm. Damn it, Kim, hurry the hell up. After another half hour of shuffling around in front of my computer and staring at its screen, a notification sound told me my request had been accepted. Hey, it's me, Steven, I typed out. You've got no idea what they are doing now. Shit, what now? With a slightly shaking hand, I asked her what was going on. I was late because we had a student council meeting today, and I saw Miss Marks putting up a note on the notice board. They're going to enact a closed campus policy for the next couple of weeks. As I read Kim's message, I felt cold. Closed campus? But why now? I don't know. They wrote it's because of the field trip, but it makes no sense. In an instant, I opened my web browser to check the school's official website. Yet, when I tried to open it, I got a no internet error. I stared at it in confusion. Then I tried it again, but the result was the same. I remembered the trouble with my phone, and told myself I was wrong. It had to be a problem with my computer. I tinkered with it, checked the router, but the error persisted. There was no connection to the internet. The only thing I could still access was the school's intranet. I was out of my room a second later, and made my way to Mrs. Richter's living quarters. When she opened the door, she looked at me with a mixture of surprise and confusion. Steven? What's the matter with you today? First you leave school early pretending to be sick, and now you barge in here like this? What's going on with the internet? I half yelled at her. Mrs. Richter sighed audibly. Should have known that's what's important to you. I can't tell you much. I was informed earlier today that we're going to experience some trouble because of the renovations. It might be back later today, or it might be gone for the rest of the week. But Steven, this is your chance to finally... I didn't listen any longer. Instead, I turned around and made my way back down the hallway. She called after me, but I didn't bother to answer. I fled right back to my room, through the door, and locked it behind me. Once I was there, I sat on the bed, and for a moment I couldn't help but clutch onto my body. Closed campus policy? Our phones acting up, and now the internet's cut? No, this was no mere coincidence. This was planned. We were being isolated. A second later, I pulled out my phone and opened its browser. I saw it right away. The same error. No internet connection. God damn it, I cursed. They'd thought this through, hadn't they? I couldn't stop shaking. What the fuck do I do now? Eventually, I got a hold of my phone again and called Dad. Dad, you need to come to the school and... I'm busy, Steven. If this is another one of your tries to... No, Dad, listen to me. There's something... No, Steven. You listen to me. I don't want to hear another word about how you don't fit in and how you don't like being... But Dad, that's not... Don't you dare interrupt me, son. I'm exhausted. I'm about to catch my plane, so... Suddenly, his voice trailed off. Dad? Dad! I yelled into the phone, but got no reply. When I checked it, I saw that the call had gotten disconnected. Had he cut the connection? I tried it once more, but this time I was informed that the caller couldn't be reached. At that moment, I saw that my phone's signal was gone. I almost laughed before I began freaking out again. Even our phones, I thought. They even got our phones. Not knowing what else to do, I tried calling the cops. But even that wasn't working. Fuck. In an onset of rage, I almost threw my phone against the wall, but was interrupted when I heard someone at the door. Dude, why the fuck do you keep locking the door? God damn it, Eric. When I unlocked it, he was about to say something, but I cut him off right away. Is your phone still working? I blurted. It earned me a confused look from Eric before he pulled out his phone. In an instant, I snatched it from his hand and checked the screen. No signal, just like mine. Dude, what are you doing? He asked in annoyance before he took his phone back. They did something to the phone, see? No signal. Dude, it's probably a temporary outage. Remember last year when we didn't have any signal for... No, man, I bet they somehow jammed them, or maybe... Shit. For a moment, an awkward silence filled the room. While I pondered how they'd been able to cut our signal, Eric just watched me with a worried look on his face. So, Coach Muller talked to me. He finally started. He says he hasn't been able to get a hold of Martin all day. Asked me if I knew anything. I told him no, but... In an instant, I jerked around and focused on him. I'd completely forgotten about Martin. He was still gone? But what? Well, I thought him and Cindy skipped school and told him to get back to me, but he hasn't checked any of his messages. I tried to call him to tell him Coach is pissed at him for skipping morning training, but his phone's off. And his phone's never off. It's because of whatever they're doing to the phones. Just... Oh, come on, man, he said, shaking his head and giving me an annoyed look. They were working fine all day. I even called Melanie, and she told me she couldn't get in contact with Cindy either. She said all her calls went straight to voicemail. In an instant, dark thoughts of a different nature invaded my mind. What if they'd caught him? Or maybe, I thought, the two of them discovered something and are still out there, hiding. Maybe they'd found out what was going on here. Let's check if they're still there, I finally said. What? Maybe they're afraid to get in trouble. But why wouldn't they come out once the sun's up? I mean, it's not like Secret. Look, man, I don't fucking know. Maybe they're still waiting till school and club activities are over. It's worth a shot, isn't it? Eric looked at me for a moment, surprised at my outburst, but I could see how worried he was, how worried he'd been the entire time. Eventually, he nodded. We left the dorm behind and went in the direction of the construction area. Please be all right, Martin, please. When we got closer, I noticed a group of people nearby. One was Mrs. Wolf, and the other Mr. Wolfram, the biology teacher. They were surrounded by a group of students. Shit, what's going on over there? It's gotta be Martin, Eric called out. With that, the two of us hurried towards the commotion. We saw the worried looks of students and heard them whisper to one another. By now, we saw that Mr. Siegert was there as well. Eric pushed his way through the crowd, ignoring the curses and protests he got, and a second later I followed him. What we found wasn't Martin, but Cindy. I could see Mr. Siegert and Mrs. Wolf bending over her, holding her in place while Mr. Wolfram tried his best to hold back the students, who were trying to get closer. In an instant, Eric and I pushed ourselves past Mr. Wolfram. When I saw Cindy, I froze. The happy, bouncy girl from last night looked like an entirely different person. Her hair was wild and messy, her eyes were wide open, and her entire body was shaking. She was out of it, trying desperately to get away from the crowd surrounding her. Hey, what the hell are you... I started, but was cut off when Mr. Wolfram jerked me back. You stay right here, both of you. His voice was as monotonous as always, but much, much louder. There was a certain edge to it, a certain worry, but I could tell it was nothing but a faked attempt. What's wrong with her? Eric asked. She's sick, Mr. Wolfram answered matter-of-factly. Hey, Cindy, it's me, Steven. What's wrong with you? I called out. Instead of reacting to me, the girl was still struggling, still trying to get free, before she began screaming. No, get away from me! Don't make me! Don't... Her voice trailed off. and for a second she seemed entirely spent. All the while, Mr. Siegert was whispering to her, trying his best to calm the girl down. Shit, I cursed. Once more, I tried to push myself past Mr. Wolfram, but he was relentless. A stoic monolith staring me down with empty eyes. Yet I saw the corners of his mouth twitch more and more erratically as he focused on me. This, however, allowed Eric to dash right past him.
Cindy, what happened to you? What happened to Martin?
For a second, her eyes focused on him. Fear distorted her entire face, and her eyes were so wide they were close to popping. Then she seemed to recognize him.
He went in there, went to check, and...
Then she freaked out again, began to scream and ramble incoherently.
What the hell do you think you're doing, boy?
Mr. Siegert snapped at Eric, pushing him back.
Can't you see the girl's having a panic attack? What she needs right now is rest, not you hollering at her. Now, what's the matter with you, sweetheart?
Cindy didn't react. Instead, her eyes darted around, looking here and there in sheer and utter terror. For a moment, they came to rest on Mrs. Wolf, and she redoubled her efforts to scramble away.
Herbert, Elizabeth, we better take her to the nurse's office and call an ambulance.
With that, Mr. Siegert got a hold of Cindy, and a moment later he was joined by Mrs. Wolf and Mr. Wolfram. I remembered what I'd seen at the nurse's office. I rushed forward, trying to pull Cindy away from them. Wait, no, she's... In an instant, Mr. Siegert got a hold of me and pulled me off Cindy, who was now securely held by the two teachers.
We'll take her to the nurse's office,
Mrs. Wolf said. Mr. Siegert nodded at her before he turned back to face me.
The hell do you think you're doing, Schmidt? And you too, Brant. What the hell do you think you're doing, Schmidt? And you too, Brant. Can't you see there's something wrong with her?
He yelled at us.
Dude, he's right. She's out of it,
Eric whispered to me. Instead of reacting to him, I stared at Mr. Siegert, who stood in front of me, blocking my way. Then he seemed to notice my expression, the worry and fear in it, and his face relaxed.
All right, I can see you're worried about her, both of you. She's gonna be all right. We're just gonna take her to the nurse's office so she can calm down. Maybe the hospital,
he said. Can we go with her? I mean, we're her friends, so...
She needs rest right now, not boys pestering her. I'm sorry, but you have to wait till tomorrow.
I opened my mouth once more, wanting to say something, wanting to protest, to ask about Martin. But with each passing second, I noticed how much attention I was drawing. The students around me were watching me, and I even noticed Mrs. Wolf staring back at me. Shit, there was nothing I could do right now, was there? Finally, I just nodded at Mr. Siegert, and, defeated, left Cindy and the teachers behind, knowing they'd do something to her. Then, as the commotion dispersed, I began on my way back to the dorms, trying my best to keep my composure, and to fight back the tears of frustration.
Dude, what the hell was that all about?
Eric asked. I was about to say something, but other students still surrounded us, and I didn't know if anyone was listening in on me. Instead, I simply walked back to the dorm.
Yo, what's the matter with you, man? Talk to me,
Eric said once we were back in our dorm room, confused about my frustration and anger. My head jerked in his direction. What's the matter with me? What about you? Why didn't you do anything? Why did you just let them take her away without doing anything?
She was completely out of it. Maybe it's best if...
God fucking damn it. How can you not see what's happening here? Why don't you fucking get that they're gonna get rid of her?
Jesus fuck, calm down.
How in the hell can I calm down when no one's noticing a damn thing? How can you all just ignore it and... Damn it!
Alright, man, what exactly do you think's going on?
At first, I didn't even know where to start. How to explain it. But then I just rambled on. I told him what I thought about the field trip, the internet being gone, our phones not working, and the fact that they were going to enact a closed campus policy. Eric made a few comments here and there, especially regarding the internet, and the supposed closed campus policy coming up. At first, he was making fun of me like he usually did, even ridiculing me. The longer I went on, however, the more his attitude changed. and the more closely he listened.
Dude, I've got no clue how you come up with these things, but it's getting creepy. Do you actually believe this?
I looked at him, saw his expression, anxious and half pleading, and I knew some of my points had hit home. For a long while, we were both quiet.
So then, why is nobody else noticing anything? How come you're the only one who's figured out this... God, I don't even know. Alien invasion or whatever it is?
What about Kim? She noticed the teacher's behavior too. Maybe others did as well.
Sure, your weird Asian girlfriend who's into conspiracies is a great indicator.
I frowned, but let the comment slide. Tell me something, dude. When was the last time you paid attention during class? Hell, when was the last time you actually paid attention to anything not related to sports or training? For a moment, Eric didn't get what I was trying to say, but then his face turned dark.
Shit, you got a point there. I'm pretty much always busy with training, and same goes for everyone else, except
people like me. The ones who pay attention during class, and...
Yeah, I get it, the nerds. And you think whoever's responsible is getting rid of them to replace them under the guise of a field trip?
Yeah.
So that's why you freaked out when I told you about Mr. Thomas. And that's why you don't...
We were cut off when my phone notified me I'd gotten a message. I stared at it in confusion. It was working again? Maybe it really was just an outage, like Eric had said. In an instant, it was in my hand, and I saw I had a signal. A weak one, but still a signal. Instead of opening the message, I instantly tried calling the cops again. But once more, the call didn't go through. Shit, I cursed. Eric gave me a confused look. Dude, check your phone. Is it working again? Eric took out his phone, and I could see the surprise on his face.
No, but I just got a message.
When I checked the message, expecting it to be from Kim or hell, maybe even Dad, I saw it was from Martin. Meet me at the construction area. I'm afraid, and I'm hiding out here. I noticed something strange, he'd written. My eyes met Eric's.
It's Martin. He says he's still hiding, and...
Yeah, I got the same message. I cut him off. But...
What?
I started to think. Why that message? And why now? Then I wondered if he'd sent it earlier today, and it had only been delivered now. Even then, it just didn't add up. It's weird, I started. Why hasn't he come back? And why isn't he telling us what he found?
I don't know. Maybe he's really afraid. You saw how Cindy...
Exactly. Why would he stay hidden if his girlfriend freaked out like that? Eric opened his mouth, but then closed it again. Damn it, I cursed.
Should we check it out?
Eric asked, the uncertainty heavy in his voice.
Yeah, let's go.
Moments later, we were on our way. Night had already fallen, but Mrs. Richter was still awake. She opened her mouth to say something, most likely to tell us to get back to our room, but we were gone before she could do so. Maybe there really is something out there, I said as we ran on. Might be the reason they paused the construction for so long.
You think it's all related to those renovations?
I nodded. As we ran, we both scanned the school grounds for Mr. Siegert, but it didn't seem like he'd started on his patrol. It didn't take us long to reach the construction area. We were still a ways away when Eric stopped and pointed ahead.
Hey, is that him over there?
I looked at where he was pointing, and I could see a figure standing at the base of the scaffold, half hidden behind the tarpaulin.
Guys, I'm over here,
Martin called out to us. I took a step forward, then another, before I stopped. Why was he just peeking out at us from behind the tarpaulin? Why wasn't he coming toward us? I strained my eyes to see what was going on, but it was too dark to see anything. Eric was about to continue, but the strangest of feelings washed over me. No, this wasn't right. Not at all. In an instant, I got a hold of his arm and pulled him back. Don't.
What are you... Guys, I'm over here.
The silhouette repeated once more. It sounded exactly the same. We both stared ahead. Both crept out.
Why don't you stop hiding? Come over here instead,
Eric called out. The silhouette didn't move at all, Instead, it repeated the same thing a third time.
Guys, I'm over here. Just come over here, asshole,
Eric yelled, the anxiety visible on his face. Yet, Martin didn't move. But a moment later, a deep voice called out to us.
What'd you just call me?
We both turned around and saw Mr. Secret walking in our direction. In an instant, we booked it, and minutes later, we were back at the dorms and in our room.
Alright, man, what the fuck was that?
Eric almost yelled at me. I've got no clue, but it sure as hell wasn't Martin. Eric nodded. He opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it again. Finally, he shook his head.
Look, man, it's getting freaky. Sorry, I need to get some sleep. All this is fucking with my head,
he said, his face devoid of color. I merely nodded and watched as he went to bed. He turned away from me and said nothing else. I knew how he felt. Hell, I was as scared and confused as he was. Maybe more so. That definitely hadn't been Martin. And whoever it was had wanted us to come over to that damn construction area. Once more, I thought about Cindy. Just what the hell had she seen over there? I told myself I'd get in contact with her and ask her, but they'd taken her to the nurse's office. A futile laugh escaped my mouth. No, there'd be no point in talking to her. By now, she was most likely... I couldn't help but start shaking again. Once more, I just sat there, trying my best to keep the panic at bay. Then I thought about Martin. I had hoped he'd be okay, but now? There was no doubt. Somehow they'd gotten him. And now there was some sort of different version of him out there. Or at least something that could mimic his voice. I don't know for how long I sat in my chair, staring at my phone, waiting for the signal to come back again, ready to call the cops at a moment's notice. But it never did. Eventually, I just dozed off. I woke up to a noise nearby. For a moment, I didn't know what it was, and my eyes darted around in panic. Then I realized it was coming from my computer. The intranet chat with Kim was still open, and message after message flooded the screen. She was typing furiously, her words full of mistakes, and it was clear she was freaking out. From what I could make out, she couldn't sleep and went for a run, but noticed a multitude of people outside. Most of them had been students, but there'd also been Mrs. Wolfe, Mr. Thomas, and some other teachers. Wait, how late was it? When I checked the computer's clock, I saw it was not even 5 in the morning. As I read on, I learned that most of them were on their way to school and other training facilities. But why had they all been outside this early? It was her next message that told me why. Kim said they'd all been coming from the construction area. That damn construction area. What the hell was going on in that place? And why were they all out there in the middle of the goddamn night? Then I thought about those weird sounds I'd heard. It had sounded like work was being done out there. Like digging. Were they all out there to work on something? To finish those damned renovations? I think one of them saw me. I finally read. Shit, I cursed. Eric stirred in his bed and stared over at me, still half asleep and not understanding what was going on. It's gonna be okay. You're in your room, right? I wrote back. Oh, thank God you're there. What do I do if they come for me? Calm down. I don't think they'll just come for you while you're in the dorms. It would cause too much of a racket. Are you sure? Yeah, I typed, but I wasn't sure at all. Okay, here's what you do. Try to pretend to be sick and stay away from the school. I'll try to do the same thing, and maybe we'll be able to sneak out later and meet up. For almost a minute, I got no answer from her, and I wondered if she really was safe in her room or if they'd come after her. Then another message arrived. Okay, I'll get back to you later. Damn it, Kim, don't scare me like that. What's going on? Eric asked. It was Kim. She saw people outside. I started, and explained to him we'd been in contact via the old internet chat, and what she'd just seen. What the hell? I nodded and went to the window to peek outside. Yet I saw nothing. No surprise there, I thought. The construction area was at the other end of the school grounds. Then I began to pack up my things. Dude, what are you doing? I'm getting the hell out of here. But how are you even... I don't fucking know, alright? But I'm not going back to that damn school. I snapped back at him. Eric just stared at me, but said nothing. As quietly as I could, I pushed open the window and heaved myself onto the windowsill. Suddenly, Mr. Siegert appeared out of the nearby darkness, staring me down with a deep frown on his face. There was no need for words. His expression was enough. "Don't you dare try anything, boy," he seemed to say. Fuck. I cursed under my breath and threw the window shut again. "What?" Eric asked, his voice quiet and strained. "Siegert's out there. He's probably keeping a watch on the dorm so no one skips out. Hell, he's probably watching us." For a moment, I considered trying to chance it and try outrunning him. But then what? The campus was closed, the gate probably locked. I was also sure he'd inform the rest of the staff if I ran. It would only be moments before half the teachers would come hunt me down. Then I thought about the walls surrounding the school grounds, but I knew there was no way in hell I'd be able to climb them. No. For all I knew, there was no way out for me. Not right now. Maybe not at all. The more I thought about it, the more I really thought about it, the more I realized that this place had long stopped being a school and had become nothing but a prison, isolated in the middle of nowhere. "What now?" Eric asked. I just stood there thinking hard. Maybe I'd be able to hide somewhere in the dorm and sneak out during the day. Eventually, I turned to Eric. "Alright, man, listen. You act like you normally do. I don't think you're in any danger, at least not for now. Because you're a... Yeah, I'm not a nerd. What are you gonna do?" "I'll try to hide in the dorms and sneak out later. Maybe we can get out of here at one point, like during lunch. You've snuck out before, right? So, you know how to get out of the school?" "Yeah, I know, but..." "Alright. If Mrs. Richter or anyone else asks, tell them I went insane and snuck out or something. Oh, and if you run into Kim, tell her about the plan. And that I'm alright." Eric nodded, but I could see how anxious he was. After he'd left for morning training, I just sat there on my bed, considering where I'd be able to hide. For minutes, I racked my brain. I considered hiding somewhere in the room, but I was sure Mrs. Richter would find me. Maybe I could hide in the bathroom, or, hell, the showers. Before I could follow through on my plan, however, an angry Mrs. Richter burst into the room. I jerked up and stared at her with wide eyes. "Mrs. Richter, what are you..." I asked, shocked, and backed away from her. "Don't you dare, Mrs. Richter, me, Stephen," she yelled at me. "I know you were out drinking the other night. And last night, you and Eric just dashed off without so much as saying a word. And now, Mr. Siegert informs me you were trying to do the same thing this morning. I swear, Stephen, this is the last straw. Now get ready for class." I just looked at her, waiting for her to leave. But she didn't budge. Not even an inch. "Well, Stephen, I'm waiting." "This is ridiculous. I'm staying right here. Don't you get what's..." I started, but she cut me off right away. "I don't care what you have to say. Or do you want me to call Mr. Siegert? I'm sure he'd be more than happy to drag you to school personally." For a while longer, I held her gaze. But then, cursing to myself, I got my backpack and put on my shoes. "Seriously, Stephen, what's the matter with you these days?" I turned to her for a moment. Her face showed an expression of misery and honest concern. When I saw her like this, I knew she was still the same Mrs. Richter, and I knew she cared. I opened my mouth to tell her what was going on, but before I could, she spoke up again. "We can talk later, but for now, it's time for school." With that, she pushed me out of the room. As I mixed in with the trail of other students walking to school, I desperately thought of what to do. I couldn't go to school. I just couldn't. For a second, panic washed over me, and my eyes darted around wildly trying to find a way out. That's when I saw Mr. Siegert, and from the way he looked at me, I could tell he knew I was up to something. It wasn't only him, either. Other students were stealing glances at me, watching my behavior. Shit, I couldn't do anything. As the first students entered the school, I slowly let myself fall back. Maybe, just maybe, I'd be able to... "What are you doing, Stephen? Classes are about to start," Miss Marks, who'd appeared right next to me, asked. I jerked toward her in shock. Where the hell had she come from?
"Now get going,"
she said, her voice monotonous. But I saw the tiny changes to her face. Her eyes had grown wider, and the corners of her mouth were twitching more noticeably. "Everything all right over here?" I heard Mr. Siegert ask from nearby. His eyes still rested on me, waiting for me to get going. "Well, Stephen?" Cursing, I set out towards the school's front door. If I couldn't run off now, maybe I'd be able to get out during break. Hell, maybe I'd be able to sneak off to the bathroom. The moment I set foot in the building, I noticed a commotion in front of the notice board. I guess the news had finally spread. I heard multiple students speaking up, protesting and rambling on about this supposed closed campus policy. "What now?" I heard someone call out, the anger audible in his voice. "Are there no midterms or finals? What the hell?" "It says because of that stupid field trip," another student added. "I don't care about the field trip. I was going to hang out with my boyfriend this weekend," a girl cursed. The commotion only grew as more and more students arrived and learned about the news. Yet, I noticed them. Students like Daniel and Andrea, who mingled between those other angry students, but merely watched the situation and didn't react at all. I shuddered as I watched them. Maybe this was my chance to run, but a single glance towards the front door showed me Miss Marks was still there, standing watch. Before long, Mr. Hubert arrived and dispersed the crowd. His voice was loud as always, but I noticed the missing anger and the sternness right away. They'd gotten him, too, and by now probably every other teacher in this goddamn building.
"I'm sure you're all confused about what's going on, but classes are about to start. Go to your classrooms, students."
I heard a few students mouth up, bombarding him with questions, but he merely stared at them, not saying a word. Soon enough, the angry, grumbling students did as they were told. Once more, I joined in with the rest, and entered my classroom. The class was in an uproar, and the students were talking about the closed campus policy. Not all of them, however. Some just sat there, not caring about it at all. Suddenly the door burst open, and Mr. Wolfram entered. Then my heart skipped a beat when I noticed Mr. Thomas behind them.
"Stephen, glad you're here,"
he said in his monotonous voice as he approached me. I just stared at him, frozen in shock.
"Good news,"
he continued, and I noticed an almost anticipatory twitch in the corners of his mouth.
"You've been chosen for the field trip. Now come along, so we can discuss the details."
My heart rate went up. My breath came in short, hard bursts, and my head was spinning. For a moment, the panic I felt was so overwhelming I thought I'd pass out. But then I screamed at myself to stay conscious. Shit, I knew they'd come for me eventually. I knew they would, but I'd thought they'd stick to the regular class schedule. Goddamn idiot, I cursed at myself. Of course they take no chance. Not with all the trouble I'd caused until now. "No," I said in a shaken voice. I'm not interested."
"But Stephen,"
he said, stepping up to me and putting his hand on my arm.
"It's important for your future."
I didn't move. Instead, I squirmed under his hand, which was slowly closing around my wrist.
"Now, let's go."
By now, his voice was much louder, strained, almost angry. His face was right in front of mine. His eyes were wide open, and he held onto me with an iron grip. Behind him, I saw at least 3 other students, all watching the exchange with empty, emotionless faces. By now, even Mr. Wolfram focused on me. I heard other students whisper, asking what was wrong with me. I didn't pay them any notice. Instead, I focused on Mr. Thomas and Mr. Wolfram behind him. When the biology teacher set out, most likely to help Mr. Thomas to lead me from the room, and wherever they took the students, I finally got up. Fine, I'll join. It's for my future, after all. I spat at them. Mr. Thomas's emotionless face distorted. and for a second I could see him trying to form the approximation of a smile. The rest of the class was ignoring me again, and even Mr. Wolfram had turned away to begin the class.
"This is a fantastic chance. You will learn a lot,"
Mr. Thomas continued, as he led me down the hallway. As he babbled on right next to me, his voice sounded almost like a recording of my once favorite teacher. Yet all the emotions were gone, all the character, leaving it nothing but a hollow mockery. My mind was racing. I had to get away. I somehow had to get away. I looked for something, anything. Then I saw it. The stairs. I walked on right next to him. His hand was still closed around my wrist, but had slightly loosened when I'd relented to come along. The moment the stairs were right next to me, I jumped forward. Mr. Thomas's hand slipped off my arm, and I half stumbled, half rushed down the stairs, barely able to keep my balance. From above, I heard him call after me. I didn't react, didn't turn around. No, I had to get away from him, and I had to get out of this school. Mr. Thomas called out once more, and then I heard his quick, heavy footsteps as he came after me.
"Stephen, we've got to discuss the details of the field trip,"
he called after me. The moment I reached the bottom of the stairs, I rushed down the hallway.
"Come back here this instant!"
By now, his voice was distorted and reverberated through the hallway. For the blink of an eye, I looked over my shoulder. He was closing in on me with steps far too wide for his stature. His legs bent impossibly as he got closer and closer to me. It looked like they had too many joints in them. Too many or none. I ran as fast as I could, but I knew I couldn't get away. Fear surged hot through my body. He was too damn fast. It was only a matter of time before he'd get me. What do I do? What the fuck do I do? In my mind, I already saw him get a hold of me. Saw him drag me away to whatever hell they'd taken all the other students to. I reached the end of the hallway, turned right and continued down another. Then I saw an open door. It was a chemistry laboratory, and it was empty. In an instant, I rushed inside and threw myself under one of the bulky laboratory tables. I hoped, no, prayed that he'd continue down the hallway. But a moment later, that hope was shattered, and he entered the room. For a moment, everything was quiet, but then he began to pace the room. When he passed the table I was under, I watched in horror as his body shifted and changed itself. With each step, he seemed to grow taller, but also thinner, becoming an elongated version of himself. His arms grew, extended themselves, getting longer and longer, changing into scrawny appendages that dangled from his body, ending in long, bony fingers that almost scratched over the room's floor. I was shaking with fear as I watched this horrific, twisted version of him. He continued to make his way through the room, his legs bending backwards, then sideways, as if all the joints in them had been placed randomly, as if they were shifting and wandering. When the thing spoke again, I had to cover my mouth to stifle a scream.
"Come out, Stephen,"
the creature said in its distorted voice. By now, it could barely bring out the words, couldn't even form my name. But for the first time, I could hear emotions from the thing, the unrestrained mockery ringing from its words. When the creature reached the end of the room, I couldn't take it anymore. Fear washed over me, hot, burning panic. I crawled out from under the table and half ran, half stumbled to the door. When I was there, the creature's head jerked around in a 180-degree angle. Its eyes were close to popping, and its mouth hung wide open. When it raised its arms, when it reached out for me, it seemed almost able to reach me from the back of the room. The thing rushed me, its body moving backward like a horrific caricature of a human being. I couldn't tear myself from the surreal sight. I took one step, then another, and bumped right against the doorframe. It was enough to break the trance, and I stumbled from the room and into the hallway. But it was too late. One of the creature's appendages, one of its bony hands, got a hold of me. Its fingers were as thin as twigs, but incredibly strong. I struggled, tried to run, but crashed to the floor when I was jerked backwards. I screamed up, but before I could even form the word help, One of its hands covered my mouth. Then the creature pulled me back and lifted me up in front of itself. I watched as its head moved forward, watched as the neck bent, then stretched further and further. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural purplish hue as they focused on me. Its mouth opened wider and wider. I saw its jaw pop and unhinge, and for a short, terrible second, I thought the thing would swallow me whole. The creature bellowed at me in its distorted, high-pitched voice. The strange noise stabbed at my eardrums and made my head hurt with each of its non-words. Once more, I struggled. I tried desperately to get free, to scream, but it was impossible. This creature, this thing that had once been Mr. Thomas, was too strong. It said, as it stepped toward the hallway, dragging me after itself. Right at that moment, I heard footsteps outside. They were getting louder, closer, and a second later, I heard someone curse in the hallway outside.
What the hell's going on in there?
For a moment, Mr. Thomas's eyes focused on me again, before his head retreated. His body folded into itself, as the creature transformed back into its human form. His hold on me, however, never loosened. "Help!" I called out when I saw Mr. Muller stepping into the room. "Mr. Muller, he wants to drag me away and—"
"Quiet, you,"
he snapped at me. Then his eyes wandered to Mr. Thomas, to his hand holding on to me.
"What's going on here, Marcus?"
he demanded.
"This boy here, John, is trying to skip the field trip. I'm sure you understand."
"I don't give a damn about that field trip of yours. Just tell me,"
he continued, staring first at me and then back at Mr. Thomas.
"Why are you dragging a student through the halls as if you're mad? It's his damn right to refuse that silly trip of yours. The hell's the matter with you these days?"
Mr. Thomas just stared at him. His face was entirely empty, and for a moment it seemed as if he'd stopped working.
"The field trip is of the utmost importance, so—"
"And I told you I don't give a shit about it. Do you have any idea how much trouble it's been causing me these past few days? Who the hell even came up with—"
"There's no field trip, Mr. Muller. It's a ploy." I cut him off. He eyed me with a mixture of confusion and frustration, before something akin to anger replaced it.
"All right, that's it. Stephen here's coming with me. I think that's acceptable, right, Marcus?"
Mr. Thomas just stood there, not saying a thing. But after a few seconds, he released me, turned around, and walked off as if nothing had happened. Mr. Muller let out a wordless curse before he pushed me forward.
"Get going, damn you. How come it's always you who's causing trouble?"
he snapped at me. For a second, I watched him, but the anger on his face was genuine. His eyes weren't wide, but had turned to hard slits as he stared me down. "Sorry, Mr. Muller," I forced myself to say as I set out. I was angry. Wanted to yell at him to make him understand what was going on. But I knew, if I just rambled on, there'd be no way he'd believe me. Once we reached his office, he threw open the door.
"Get inside, now,"
he commanded. The moment we were inside, he let himself fall into his heavy chair, staring me down.
"Now, what's the story about Mr. Thomas dragging you away?"
His eyes were hard, his face distorted by a deep frown that looked as if it was carved into his forehead. For a moment, I was quiet and gathered my thoughts. Then, I explained to him what I'd noticed about the other teachers, their behavior. But before I could even go on about the field trip and what had happened to so many other students, he cut me off, shaking his head.
"You on drugs, boy?"
I heard the words, but I was dumbfounded. My mouth was still open, but I was at a loss for words. "But, Mr. Muller, you noticed how weird Mr. Thomas was acting, right? And what about that field trip? I mean, you said—"
"You know, Stephen, I heard some boys snuck out the other night, getting drunk and doing God knows what."
"What? That's got nothing to do with—"
"It damn well does. And I know it was you, Eric, and probably Martin as well. Heard you skipped class the next day because you were still drunk or drugged out of your mind. Tell you the truth, I don't give a rat's ass about you. But don't you dare drag those two down with you. Eric looked like shit when he showed up for morning training. And Martin hasn't shown up to practice since. With the new season,
It's because Martin's gone. They got him when he climbed the scaffold at the construction area.
trespassing too, eh? You want to know something, Steven? Why do you think I never bother with you? Why do you think I let all that shit you pull slide? Because you're fucking useless, that's why. I'd have kicked you off the track and field trip a long time ago. And there's this damn rule that says... Fucking hell,
I screamed. Why's no one ever listened to me? None of that fucking matters. What's important?
Now you listen to me, boy. And you listen well.
He started as he got up, his face red with anger.
Don't you ever talk to me like this again. I don't care how much money your father pays to have you attend this school. This ends now.
But I tried once more, but I didn't get the chance to say anything.
Quiet. I was on my way to the principal anyway, and I'll make sure to inform her about your transgressions. But I'll dare you, boy. If you're not here when I get back, I'll have you suspended for good.
With that, and without saying another word, he stormed out the door and threw it behind himself. The man was an asshole, and I'd lie if I said I didn't hate him, but I still wanted to warn him, to tell him not to go. But I couldn't get out a single word during his long, angry tirade. I thought about going after him, but what would it do? He wouldn't believe a word I'd say. Even worse, he'd probably drag me along to Mrs. Wolf himself. I cursed at myself. He was right. I was frickin' useless. Then I shook my head and told myself to get a grip. I had to get out of this damn school, and this was my chance. Slowly and quietly, I cracked open the door, half expecting Mr. Muller to be waiting for me. But it seemed he actually had stormed off. I rushed down the hallway, then the stairs, and a moment later I was at the front door. I heard someone calling after me, heard footsteps, but then I was outside, and long gone before they could reach me. Then I began to think. I couldn't go to the dorms. No doubt they'd inform Mrs. Richter about me fleeing the school. Instead, I rushed off towards the other end of the schoolyard. As I ran, my mind was racing. What now? Should I chance running away? One look at the front gate told me what I already knew, though. It was closed, most likely securely locked and under surveillance by Mr. Siegert. I couldn't stay near the school building. The track and field stadium, however, it was on the other end of the school grounds. I dashed on, staying clear of the open walkways, ran past the football field, and staggered on from training facility to training facility, constantly checking the surrounding area, seeing if anyone was following me. My legs were as heavy as lead. I was panting and out of breath, but finally made it to the stadium. I wanted nothing more than to sit down, to rest, but I had to find a hiding place. The equipment shacks, I thought, before I realized they checked those right away. I'd be trapped in there. Then I saw a patch of trees at the side of the stadium. It wasn't much, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough to stay hidden. Once there, I sat between the trees and watched the school grounds. I expected the doors to burst open, and for staff to fill out and start on a desperate search for me. But all was quiet. Then I laughed. There was no need to, was there? I was trapped either way. I couldn't escape from the school. Not on my own, anyway. So why would they have to hurry? They could just continue with business as usual. At least for now. God damn it. After a few minutes and with shaking hands, I took up my phone. Instantly, I saw I had no signal. I laughed again. Fucking hell. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled between the trees. It felt like an eternity had passed, and I'd half nodded off multiple times before lunch break finally arrived. From afar, I watched as students flocked inside and began gathering all over the schoolyard. I scanned the distant figures, watched their movements, but no one set out for me. Everything was normal. Or so I thought. Soon enough, I noticed a commotion, and a group of students gathered together. I thought about Eric right away. Don't tell me they knew what we were up to. Shit, please, just tell them some bullshit story. Yet, would they believe him? What if they... No, calm down. Eric was an idiot, sure, but he was one of the craftiest idiots I knew. I was sure he could get out of the situation somehow. As I sat there, the minutes slowly turned to hours, and the thought of making a break for it clawed at my mind again and again. Yet I screamed at myself to stay put, to not do anything crazy. Eric's words came back to my mind. He said he knew how to get out, and there had to be some truth to it. And so I just sat there, quietly watching the school grounds, not sure what to do. I thought about meeting up with Eric, but where? Then I remembered I told him to act normal, and to pretend nothing was wrong, which meant that he'd most likely go through his usual routine, and until it was over, I was nothing but a sitting duck. Eventually, classes ended, and I watched as students flooded from the school. Some went to their respective dorms, while others set out for the various training facilities and sports fields. Now I definitely couldn't get away, not with all of them out here. It wasn't long before Mr. Muller showed up at the stadium. As I watched him, I saw his strange, stalking movements, and got proof of what I'd already known. They'd gotten him too. For a moment, his eye focused on the tree line I was hiding behind, and cold sweat broke out all over my body. Then he hurried away again, and scanned the stadium meticulously, before he approached the first of the two equipment shacks. I heard him rummage through the contents before he repeated the same process for the second one. Eventually, he returned outside and made his way towards the tree line. I inched back, trembling in fear, and pushed myself against one of the heavy trunks, ready to make a break for it at any moment. I was saved when the first members of the track and field team arrived. The man turned around and began on his usual training regimen. All the while, however, his eyes darted around, scanning the area, on a constant lookout for me. As practice went on, I inched closer to the wall surrounding the school grounds. A single glance upward told me there was no way in hell I'd be able to scale it. Instead, I just sat there, anxiously, watching as the members of the team continued running their laps. As I watched, things almost seemed normal. But I knew the truth. I knew what was going on. And as I watched students run lap after lap, I wondered how many of them were still normal. Eric was right there amongst them, but there was no way I could approach him. Not right now. For long minutes, I watched how he moved, how he spoke, and saw him joke with his friends. I noticed how desperately he tried to act normal, and how he barely succeeded at it. Yet it was proof he was still himself. Once the training ended, I forced myself to continue sitting in my hiding spot. I was shaky, anxious, but I waited unmoving until the sun had set, and everyone had returned to their dorms. Finally, I inched forward and scanned the school grounds carefully. When everything seemed clear, I set out. It was a painfully slow process. All I wanted to do was rush the dorms right away, talk to Eric, and get the hell out of here. Yet I knew I couldn't do that, because I soon realized I wasn't alone out here after all. Sure, Mr. Siegert hadn't started on his rounds yet, but some students were still outside, walking around the school grounds in the dark, keeping an eye out for me, or any other student who might have noticed what was going on. A shiver went down my spine when I noticed a nearby student's face. It was distorted, barely resembling that of a human being. His eyes weren't where they should have been, and instead had moved to the side of his head to give him a wider field of vision. The ghastly creature scanned the surrounding area, but after a while it thankfully moved on. Before long, I realized that many of the students out here weren't normal. Their bodies were twisted into shapes entirely alien. Some moved on all fours, more animalistic than human. Others had long, snake-like necks, scanning the branches of the trees above. One had fingers as long as their arms, delicately probing the ground and the tree trunks, as if looking for tracks. I watched them with wide, terrified eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd seen how Mr. Thomas had changed, had transformed. But as outlandish as his transformation had been, these out here were far, far worse. For the longest time, I'd still thought this was nothing but people being replaced by copies, by doppelgangers. Hell, maybe robots after all. The horrors I saw out there, however, the misshapen, twisted abominations that had once been my fellow students, told me this was something different. Whatever was responsible, whatever these things were, they weren't human. Or even human-made. No. They were only pretending to be to stay unnoticed. My God. Just what the hell was going on here? And what was responsible for it? I continued on, one step at a time, trying my hardest to avoid the gaze of the not students. My hands were shaking and my palms were sweaty. These abominable watchers seemed to be everywhere, their eyes scanning the entirety of the school grounds. But at the same time, they did their best to stay hidden. The boys' dorm was only a few minutes away, but it felt like hours passed before I finally reached it. I pushed myself alongside the wall, past window after window before I reached the one to our room. I scanned the area once more, before I pushed myself up and gave the window 2 quick knocks. It took only a second before Eric ripped open the window, but I still felt like a trapped animal on display.
Shit, dude, where the hell you been? I thought, move!
I cut him off and climbed inside. Then I threw the window shut and drew the curtains. I've been hiding, isn't that obvious?
Yeah, but I thought they got you when I didn't see you during lunch break. Fuck, man, this entire school's gone crazy.
I looked at him. Guess you finally see it.
Hard to miss once you start looking. Like, really looking. Hell, Daniel and a bunch of the others cornered me during lunch break, asking me why you ran, and that I should tell you to see Mr. Thomas because of that damn field trip.
Shit, I think I saw that. How the hell did you get out of that one? Eric shrugged, giving me a grin.
Well, told him exactly what you said I should do. Then you went crazy and a lot of other bullshit. What the hell happened to you, man? You look like shit.
As I told him what had happened with Mr. Thomas, his eyes grew wide, and seemed to grow even wider when I told him what I'd seen outside. This time, it was out of pure and utter shock. No hint of disbelief remained on his face.
Jesus fucking Christ,
he whispered.
We've got to get out of here.
They're looking for me all over the place. It's only a matter...
Martin's back,
Eric suddenly said. Wait, really? Where the hell is he?
In the common room, pretending like nothing's wrong. I talked to him, but he's acting like a different person. Fuck, man, what the hell did they do to him?
I said nothing. That night, we'd see him. And I knew they'd gotten him. I knew. But deep inside, I still hoped it was some sort of fake. And that the real Martin had somehow gotten away. But now? Damn it, I cursed, trying to fight back the tears that came to my eyes. Then I told myself to pull it together. All right, you said you know how to get out, right? I mean, you've told me you've snuck out before. Eric gave me a weary nod before he sighed.
Well, not really, and never during closed campus. I know how to get booze over the wall, but I never actually...
What? Didn't you say...
I know what I said. Listen, I might not have done it myself, but I know for a fact that Robert used to get out all the time.
So? I snapped at him, growing angry at his long-winded explanation.
Well, you know about the service entrance at the back of the school, right? The one behind the cafeteria?
I nodded, but I didn't get what he was trying to say.
Robert got his hands on a key and made a duplicate. All we gotta do is make our way there, unlock the door, and we're out.
That's great and all, but Robert isn't fucking here anymore. Did you forget they kicked him out months ago?
Dude, chill, okay?
How can I fucking chill? Don't you get it, man? They could be coming for me, for us, any minute now. Eric cursed to himself, but was quick to continue.
Robert never hid his stash in his room. Too big of a risk to be found out. Instead, he hid it down in the basement. That's where he hid the key. Last time I spoke with him, he said it's still down there.
Okay, good. But how do we get in? Mrs. Richter always locks the basement door, and she's the only one with a key. Eric gave me a grin.
There's a way to get to the basement from outside. Just follow me.
With that, he made his way to the window. But right at that moment, I remembered Kim.
Hold on, what about Kim? Did you see her?
Eric shook his head.
No clue. Had no time to look for her.
Shit, I cursed and went to the computer. I knew we didn't have time for that, but shit, I couldn't just leave her.
What are you...
Hold on, let me hit her up.
Can we trust her? What if she's... you know...
I stopped for a moment and just stared at the chat window. No, I told myself. Not Kim. She'd been with me this entire time, and was the only one who'd understood what was going on. Yet, I hesitated. Eventually, I just hit her up, typing out a short message. Kim, are you okay? She started typing, once, twice, but it still took her almost a full minute to finish the message. Yes, but I'm so scared. Everyone's acting so weird, like the entire school. I'm hiding in my room, but what if they come for me? Someone was at the door before. I don't know what to do anymore. I just don't. Reading the message, I could tell she was out of it, and I could almost feel her anxiety pouring from the screen. There might be a way out, I finally typed. But what about everyone else? We can get help once we make it outside. Then I stopped for a moment and thought about where to meet up. There was no way we could risk going to the girls' dorm. The best place would be the school. No, the cafeteria itself. Let's meet up in the old cafeteria. What? But I can't just break into the school. Yes, you can, Kim. I know you can. I saw her typing, but no message arrived. Behind me, Eric was growing restless.
Dude, what's taking so long?
Eric demanded.
We don't have time for this. Can we trust her or not?
Yeah, I think we can. Look at her messages. Eric looked at the computer screen, then back to me, not understanding. Think. What do all the teachers and those weird students have in common? They all act emotionless and talk monotonous, but she's out of it. There's no way she'd be able to fake that. For a moment, he was quiet, mumbling to himself before he nodded. Just be there, Kim, all right? I typed. Eventually, she sent me another message. Okay, I'll try.
Okay, let's get going already,
Eric whispered before he carefully pushed open the window. With more finesse than I'd thought he had, he leaned on the windowsill, pretending to stare outside, simply enjoying the evening breeze. Then he went away, hiding himself from view again.
All right, I don't see anyone outside.
With that, Eric swung himself onto the windowsill, and a moment later he was outside. For a second, I stared at the darkness, scanning the entire area around the dorm before I followed him. We pressed our bodies as close to the wall as possible, and hidden in the shadows, we dashed to a few small bushes growing at the back of the dorm. At first, I had no clue what Eric was doing, but then I noticed a small basement window. Yet, half a dozen safety bars blocked the damn thing off.
Robert discovered it by accident, but some of the bars are rusted, and he got 2 of them loose.
Without even waiting for me to say anything, Eric went forward, pulled out 2 of the bars, and a moment later we pushed ourselves through the small opening. The basement was dark and musty. Thick cobwebs hung in the higher, more distant corners, and everything inside seemed to be hidden under a heavy layer of dust. The entire room was filled with old, unused furniture, boxes, and crates.
He hid the key in a box on the right, between a bunch of old towels and bed sheets.
I nodded, and together we opened box after box. We found old books, dishes, and cutlery, but there was no hint of towels or bed sheets.
Shit, where the hell is it?
Eric cursed. Maybe he got it wrong, or he was fucking with you, I mumbled. Eric said nothing and continued his frantic search. I joined in with him again, but after a while I decided to check the boxes on the other side of the room. I'd barely reached them when I stepped in something. A small puddle had formed on the floor. I stared at it, confused. A leak? Down here? Then I shook my head. We didn't have time for this. We should be on our fucking way already. Keep searching, you idiot. The moment I lifted my foot, however, it felt like it was stuck to the ground. When it finally came loose, I realized that what I'd stepped in was some sort of slime. What the hell? Slowly, ever so slowly, my eyes got used to the darkness of the basement, and I saw the entire wall near it was covered in cobwebs. Yet, when I stared at them, they seemed too big, too heavy. Their strands were as thick as twigs, and they were sticking to the wall. The disgusting, slimy liquid I'd stepped in seemed to originate from them. Almost in a trance, I stepped forward, but then I heard something. From the other side of the room, I heard Eric rummaging through box after box. But it wasn't him. No. What I heard was some sort of squishing sound coming from nearby, from a stack of crates in front of me. Driven by the strangest sense of curiosity, I stepped forward, careful not to step in any more of the strange liquid. Then I picked up a small metal rod and reached out for the disgusting cobwebs. Instead of tearing apart, they stuck to the metal, as if they too were made of the same slime. What the hell was that stuff? And what were those sounds?
Found it,
I suddenly heard Eric say. A second later, the beam of light from his phone darted across the room to find me. For a moment, it illuminated something ahead of me, and that's when I screamed. I didn't understand what I was seeing. It had been some sort of growth, a twitching, living mass stuck to the wall in front of me, and all those disgusting cobwebs seemed to originate from it. And then, I heard something else. The same disgusting squishing sounds, as if something was moving. It was nothing but a bubbling, half-suffocated sound. Then a shudder went through the room. Caskets and boxes tumbled over, and I cringed back in fear, thinking whatever I'd seen was coming for me. A second later, Eric reached me.
Dude, what the hell are you doing?
He snapped at me.
They'll hear us.
Instead of answering, I could only point ahead, right where the disgusting thing had been. Yet, when the beam of Eric's phone hit the wall, there was nothing there. Nothing but a puddle on the floor, and a crack that ran the entire height of the wall.
What is it?
I just stared ahead. There was nothing there. Had I just imagined it? No, I thought. That puddle was still there. And that crack? Whatever I'd just seen must have retreated. I didn't get to think about it any longer because Eric got a hold of me and pulled me toward the window.
We gotta get out of here.
But it was already too late. The door to the basement burst open, and Mrs. Richter stepped inside. The light from the staircase made her appear taller, bigger, a hulking beast of a woman, ready to pounce on us at any moment.
What do you think you're doing down here?
I froze, opening my mouth to say something, to make some sort of excuse. But then I saw how she looked at us. Her eyes were wide and empty, and her mouth was twitching erratically. Dear God, no. They'd gotten her too. When I snuck out, they must have called her over, and then...
We heard something. Thought someone was calling for help, so...
Eric started, and his voice trailed off when Mrs. Richter slowly approached us.
And instead of coming to me, you decided to sneak in here on your own? You and Steven?
I watched as she spread out her arms, as if to block the basement door. Saw her open her hands wide, and then her body began contorting. Beneath the folds of her clothing, her flesh was twitching, moving, changing, and I watched in horror as she grew taller, and her arms lengthened. A second later, I charged forward, and with all the strength I could muster, I threw myself against her. For a second, the thing that had once been Mrs. Richter stumbled, before it tripped and crashed against an old wardrobe. There was a sickening crunch before the thing crashed to the ground.
Dude, what did you just...
Eric asked. Come on, man, that's not Mrs. Richter anymore. I screamed at him. For a moment, he was confused, but then the thing on the ground began to twitch and move erratically. One of its hands shot forward and tried to get a hold of Eric, but I pulled him away. Together, the two of us rushed up the stairs, followed by the thing's high-pitched screaming. Other students who must have heard the commotion were already in the hall, But before any of them could approach us, we fled from the dorms. In the night's cover, we dashed away, but then I stopped at a small grove of trees nearby.
Dude, what?
Eric was about to start, but I put my hand over his mouth. I knew we weren't alone out there, and I knew those things were still searching for me. For us. But thankfully, they didn't seem to have hurt him. Eric stared at me in confusion, but then I pointed at a nearby figure and motioned for him to be quiet. For once, he understood me right away. Then I leaned in close to him.
They've all become just like Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Richter,
I whispered. Eric opened his mouth to say something, but then he only nodded. Once we both caught our breath, we set out again. Once more, we had to be slow and careful, moving from tree to tree, scanning the surrounding area. Finally, after what seemed like forever, we made it onto the school grounds. We were on our way past the playground when Eric stopped me. His eyes darted around, scanning the area before he turned back to me, pointing towards the school. I saw them. Dark figures moving near the building, most likely looking for us. Shit, there were so many of them. Did Kim actually make it? Or... When the figures vanished, Eric was about to dart forward, but I stopped him.
What about Kim? I asked. I mean, I told her to get to the cafeteria, but we don't have time to look for her, dude.
Eric cut me off. I cursed, but he was right. Eventually, I gave him a nod. Together, we inched forward and made it to the corner of the school building. Then we both darted towards the front door. At night, the school felt like a different place. It was bigger, a looming monstrosity, its dark, empty windows staring down at us from above. The entire place felt wrong, eerie, and more than a bit unsettling. The moment we reached the front door, we found it unlocked. A strange feeling washed over me. Why the hell was it unlocked? Had it been Kim? Then I told myself there was no way this tiny Asian girl could pick the lock. So if not here, then... What the hell was going on here at night? With as little noise as possible, we cracked open the door, and I peeked inside while Eric kept watch over the nearby area. Everything was clear, and we rushed inside. Once we'd moved away from the door, however, we stopped again and listened. We heard nothing. We tiptoed down the empty hallway to our left, but a moment later we heard footsteps ahead of us. Shit, someone was here after all. I wondered if it was Kim, but thinking about the unlocked door, there was no guarantee. No, if it was someone else, we'd be caught. I turned to Eric and motioned for an empty classroom to our right. There, we hid behind a desk and waited. A tall, dark figure shambled down the hallway, past the door, and was soon gone.
The hell was that?
Eric asked in a hushed whisper.
Teachers, I think,
I answered. Eric was already about to leave the room again when I stopped him.
So, how do we get to the service entrance? Like I said, it's in the old cafeteria. We just gotta make it through the main building and enter the eastern wing. That's it. Right where that damn construction area is, I mumbled.
Eric nodded. I cursed myself, remembering how the fake Martin had tried to get us out there. Shit, I had a bad feeling about this. But it was our only way out. We set out again and soon made it to the end of the hallway and continued down another one. Darkness shrouded the entire building, transforming the usual wide, long hallways into ghastly, constricted corridors. Knowing we weren't alone in the building made it even worse. Every door we passed seemed like a trap, and the moment we got close to one, I could almost see an angry, twisted teacher pouncing on us. Shit, the longer we were here, the more wrong this entire thing felt. It was a slow, arduous process, and we were both way too scared. We inched forward step by step, constantly listening for all sounds, but almost jumped past every door. Alright, I thought. We just have to make it to the main staircase, and then follow another hallway. As we moved on, we suddenly heard a voice nearby. We both pushed ourselves against the wall, trying our best to hide in the shadows, and listened. The blood was rushing through my veins, my heart pounding in my chest. Yet, the voice didn't come any closer. After more than a minute had passed, we continued on. The voice grew louder, but we realized it wasn't coming from the hallway, but from a classroom. The moment I looked past the cracked door, I saw Mr. Wolfram inside. He stood motionless behind his desk in an entirely dark classroom. At first, I didn't get what he was doing, and I thought he was merely mumbling to himself.
And so the mitochondria is responsible for...
When I saw the textbook he was holding, I realized what he was doing. He was rehearsing class, all by himself, in a dark classroom in the middle of the night. Every once in a while, his voice cracked slightly. When it happened, he stopped, before he started the sentence once more. I shivered as I watched. Eric, who stood next to me, was frozen, a mixture of fascination and horror visible on his face. When I tapped his shoulder, he jerked up and stared at me with wide eyes. We soon reached the main staircase. There was no one here, so we hurried past it and continued down another hallway. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from a room in front of us. We both froze in shock. I looked at the face in front of us, but it seemed wrong, as if all of its elements were placed randomly. It looked like someone had tried to create a human being without ever having seen one. Then I recognized the figure as old Mr. Schubert.
Thus, the Roman Empire...
he started, but didn't continue. His voice, similar to his face, wasn't right. It was distorted and high-pitched before it trailed off. His eyes became empty, and I realized what was wrong with his face. The skin was visibly sagging, almost as if it was close to tearing off. Eric and I just stood there, about to run, but Mr. Schubert didn't move, didn't even notice us, and was entirely quiet. It looked as if he'd stopped working. We inched past him, afraid for him to reach out for us at any moment, but he didn't move at all. Only when we'd made it halfway across the hallway did we hear him again.
Thus, the Roman Empire started an invasion,
he continued for a few seconds before his voice trailed off again.
Dude,
Eric mumbled, staring back at him.
No clue. Maybe he's broken or something.
Eric said nothing, but I saw him shudder visibly. After a few more seconds, we reached the end of the hallway and saw the door that led to the eastern wing and the old cafeteria. Building materials and tools had been stacked up next to the sturdy metal door, but clearly hadn't been moved for weeks, if not months. While my eyes darted around, a tiny figure pushed itself up from behind the pile. This time, I knew who it was.
Kim,
I called out in a hushed whisper, and Eric and I hurried over to her. She gave us a curt nod. For a second, she looked at us, before her eyes focused on the heavy door in front of us.
Thank God you're all right. How'd you get in? The front door,
she said in a low voice. I turned toward her, about to ask if she'd been followed, but Eric called out to me.
Shit, it won't open.
In an instant, I was next to him, and together we pushed open the heavy door. The sound of its creaking hinges and that of metal scraping over the ground made us wince. I turned around, expecting everyone in the school building to come for us.
Kim, let's go.
The small girl gave me another nod, and without saying a word, she stepped past us and began down the hallway. As I followed her, I activated my phone's flashlight and saw the state the eastern wing was in. The walls were laid bare, the doorways were gaping openings, and the rooms beyond them were empty. Yet there was no hint of any renovations. What the hell had they been doing all this time?
The hell's that?
Eric suddenly asked. He'd hurried on, but was now busy tearing his foot off the ground. Don't tell me. In an instant, I illuminated the ground and the hallway ahead of us. The same liquid. Above us, on the ceiling, the same disgusting cobwebs. Kim, hold on. Something's not right, I called after her. Kim, however, had already made it to the end of the hallway, and was busy pushing open yet another heavy door with the cafeteria sign above it. Careful not to step in any more of the puddles of liquid on the floor, we soon reached her. What I saw once I stepped through the door made no sense. I knew for a fact that we should be standing in the cafeteria, and there should have been a hallway to our right, connecting it to the library, the computer lab, and the physics department. Yet everything was just gone. All that remained were a few dilapidated walls, and everything else had been torn down. From where I was, I could even see the distant scaffold's tarpaulin fastened to the gym's outer wall, but the rest of the gym was gone too. We were in an open area. When I focused the phone's flashlight on it, I saw more of the disgusting liquid, more of the thick spider webs, and further ahead, a giant hole in the ground. These cobwebs, I realized, seemed to originate from there, from that hole, and had spread out over the entire area, the eastern wing, and even the dorms, I realized, remembering what I'd seen in the basement. Then I heard something. Shit, someone was coming. In an instant, I turned off the phone's flashlight and darted behind the remains of a broken wall and pulled Eric after me. Kim, too, had hidden herself. A moment later, a figure came into view. It was a teacher. But whoever it had once been was far too twisted and had changed into a nightmarish abomination. Almost in a trance, I took out my phone to record what we were seeing. Then I noticed that one of its giant hands was holding something. At first, I didn't know what it was. But then I noticed the movements, the struggle, saw arms and legs, and realized it was another student. He was desperately trying to get free, beating and tearing at the hand holding him. For a moment, a sound escaped his mouth, but in an instant, the creature covered it with its other hand. Shit, dude, we gotta... Eric started and was about to get up, but I pushed him back, shaking my head. We can't do anything. We'll just be taken as well. Eric cursed to himself, agitated and angry, but stayed put. All the while, I held the camera trained on the thing in front of us. For a moment, the creature stopped before its body seemed to change again, twisting around itself. I could almost hear bones snapping and flesh tearing. Then, the thing vanished into the darkness, dragging the struggling student after itself. I still held my phone in my hand, still trained on the spot where the thing had been, frozen in shock. He must have noticed what was going on here, too. Must have been just like me. Yet I'd done... Dude, let's go. Eric half snapped at me and pointed at the darkness ahead of us. If this was the cafeteria, the exit should be over there. He was about to start when Kim got a hold of my arm. Kim, what are you... I started, but my voice trailed off. For the first time, I saw her face. Could make it out for real. It was devoid of emotions. Her eyes were wide and empty, and her mouth was slightly twitching. My legs almost gave way, and all the strength left my body. No, that wasn't Kim. She was gone and had been replaced like all the others. I'd gotten away from Mr. Thomas, but they must have come after her too. Then I thought about our texts, about that damned internet chat. They must have known about it all along. Must have been spying on it. That's how they knew what we'd been planning. That's why she'd come along. And that's why she'd been able to get into the school so easily. I'd thought all those copies couldn't show emotions, and couldn't act them out. But in those past days, Kim and I had only texted, and not spoken. Dear God, what if they could communicate just fine when it wasn't face-to-face? I'd had it all wrong. How in the hell hadn't I thought about that? How could I have been so goddamn stupid? In an instant, she got hold of my phone, and a second later shattered it. Eric just stared at us, first at her and then at me. Right at that moment, Kim's mouth unhinged, and she let out a high-pitched, distorted sound. A scream so loud my ears popped. For a moment, my head was spinning. While I tried to find my bearings, Eric threw himself against the small Asian girl, tried to tear her off of me. But her small body was much, much stronger than should have been possible. Then Eric, in his desperation, picked up a nearby metal rod and brought it down on the girl's head. For a moment, she continued holding on to me. But then her grip loosened. I turned, was able to run, to flee. But then I froze again. From behind Eric, something made its way through the still open doorway. What I saw seemed much too big to have been a human being, and had too many appendages. It looked almost like a giant spider. A gigantic, emaciated, spidery thing that pushed itself through the doorway, before it approached Eric. Even now, still hunched over, the thing would have towered above any of the other twisted teachers. Its arms dangled to the ground, but there were more of them, more than just two. Then I saw the twisted, elongated face, a face I recognized instantly. "Eric, watch out!" I screamed, but it was already too late. A shocked expression washed over his face before he darted around. He didn't even get to scream before one of Mrs. Wolf's giant hands closed around his body, and another covered his mouth. She yanked him upward and held him in front of herself like a child would a doll. He dangled in her grip, struggled, tried to beat against the hands holding him, but the creature didn't even seem to feel it. She pushed her face forward, brought it right in front of Eric's, and giggled. It was the most outlandish thing I'd ever heard, and for just a few seconds, I stood there, unable to move, merely staring at the horrific creature in front of me. Then my consciousness was pushed back as anger rose inside of me. Anger at those things. Frustration at my uselessness of not having been able to help anyone. Now, though, driven by pure adrenaline, I wanted nothing more than to throw myself at this beast. Wanted to do something, anything to help my friend. Before I could, Kim was back. I saw the deep concave in the top of her head, but it had done nothing but stop her momentarily. Disgusting, slimy liquid leaked from it, ran down her face and dripped onto me. I tried to free myself, tried to get away, but nothing had any effect. A moment later, I was restrained, and could do nothing but stare at Mrs. Wolf and Eric. She was still holding him, but was now stepping forward, approaching the hole in the ground. For a moment, she just stood there, but then I heard something. The same sounds I'd heard before. The sound of something digging. No. Of something unearthing itself. A strange purplish hue emanated from the hole. Then a shifting, twitching mass dragged itself outward. No. Almost washed from the hole. It was flesh, I realized. A mass of gooey, pulsating flesh, just like I'd seen in the basement. Only much, much bigger. Impossibly so. I stared at it in utter disbelief and horror. As the thing moved, I noticed deep gashes on its surface. Orifices that opened and closed, were torn apart as it continued spilling from the hole, pumping out the same disgusting liquid. My mouth hung open, and a short, insane laugh escaped as my sanity slipped away. Instantly, a hand was pushed over my mouth, covering it, but I didn't react. I just couldn't. Instead, all I could do was stare at the unbelievable, surreal sight in front of me. My mind had stopped working and was now nothing but a blank. Then Mrs. Wolf stepped forward, at first caressing the disgusting mass of flesh, before she plunged one of her additional hands into an orifice on the thing's surface. It twitched, then began to pulsate more intensely, drenching the entire area in an even more intense purplish hue. I watched as something pushed itself outward from the flesh. It was a head, then an upper body. But it was all wrong. Malformed and misshapen. Nothing but stacked together flesh and bone. Yet there were others. More bodies. Shifting bodies, faces, limbs, that all slowly pushed themselves forward from the gooey mass. Some were moving, but they were as disfigured as the first one. Others were merely twitching, or dangling lifelessly from the mass before they were swallowed up again. Mrs. Wolf's arm surged forward, throwing Eric at the mass of arms and bodies. In an instant, they got hold of him, restrained him before they pulled him in closer. He screamed, struggled, but couldn't do anything. Finally, all these disfigured, twisted faces moved in on him, their mouths opening further and further, their jaws unhinged. I thought they'd maim him or eat him. Instead, I watched as countless feelers erupted from them, more and more pushed outward, entangling Eric's body, probing him. Eric was out of it, began tearing them off himself, but there had to be hundreds, thousands even. Then one of them found skin and plunged into his body, and moments later, dozens more followed. Eric's mouth was still open, but his screams were stifled, and no other sound escaped him. Instead, his body began twitching and convulsing. I could do nothing but watch. Watch with open eyes as the lifeblood was sucked out of him. Within seconds, his body shrank away, growing thinner, taut, gnarled, before nothing but a withered gray husk remained. At the same time, the fleshy mass began pulsating again, and I watched as something formed under its surface. At first, it was nothing but another twitching hulk of flesh, but then a head formed, followed by arms and legs. Mere moments later, I stared at a perfect replica of Eric's face that was pushed from the twitching mass of flesh. For a moment, the disgusting, wet body lay on the floor, unmoving. Then it shook itself, as if it was learning how to function. Legs moved, then arms, and finally, its eyes fluttered open. At first, nothing but mechanical clicking sounds escaped its mouth, before it spoke in a distorted version of my friend's voice.
Hey dude, hey dude, hey dude,
it repeated, testing its voice. At first, it was high-pitched and screeching, utterly distorted. But with each repetition, it was getting better, closer to the original. Yet while Eric's body was learning how to function, the weight on top of me shifted slightly. Kim was twitching too, was shaken as the thing seemed to focus on Eric's body, his copy. In an instant, I used all my remaining strength and pushed myself upward. The small body on top of me was thrown aside. I scrambled away, opened my mouth, and screamed at the top of my lungs. I didn't know if anyone was nearby, or if I could be saved. But it was all I managed to do. After only a couple of meters, I felt a hand closing around my ankle. I hit the ground with such force I saw stars. Then I felt myself being yanked backward. Eric's copy was gone, but Mrs. Wolf was still there, now pulling me back, bringing her face close to mine. Then, for the first time, the creature's mouth slowly, and under a strenuous effort, turned into the approximation of a grin.
I'm trying to help you, Stephen. That's all.
Right at that moment, I heard rustling from behind the tarpaulin of the scaffold, and the metal fence closing off the construction area being unlocked. Almost instantly, the disgusting flesh retreated, pulled itself back into the hole it had come from, dragging all the disgusting cobwebs after itself. Mrs. Wolf's face retreated before she twisted her neck to look in the sound's direction. Suddenly, her body collapsed into itself, and she returned to her human form. Walking swiftly, she approached the edge of the construction area where the sounds originated from. Then the erratic beam of a flashlight reached us, at first darting around randomly.
Schmidt? Brant? Is that you? I know you're out there. How dare you? If you...
His voice trailed off when the beam of the flashlight illuminated not only me, but Mrs. Wolf, who was still holding on to me.
Mr. Siegert, good to see you. This student here snuck into the construction area to cause havoc. You know who he is, right? When I saw him, I followed him, but he tried to attack me. I was lucky to restrain him.
The old man just stared at her, in utter bewilderment. No, Mr. Siegert, it's... I started, but in an instant, Mrs. Wolf covered my mouth.
It's the middle of the night. What the hell are you still doing out here, Elizabeth? And at the construction area of all places? Shouldn't you have left hours ago?
I was working late,
she simply said in her emotionless voice.
But should you really be worried about those things? This boy here's been causing trouble for days now. And who knows what he's been...
Let the boy speak, damn it. I haven't got the slightest clue what's been going on here for the past couple of days. And now I see not only you, but Mr. Wolfram and Mr. White at the school in the dark. What the hell's up with that?
For a moment, Mrs. Wolf was quiet and didn't move while I struggled under her grip. Then Kim, who must have hidden herself in the shadows, jumped the old man. He screamed in shock, but reacted faster than I thought possible and pushed her off himself. He tried to restrain her, but in an instant she freed herself and jumped on him again, this time going for his throat. In confusion and surprise, he tore her off and threw her to the ground. She came to rest in front of him, her head twisted sideways in a completely unnatural angle. I saw the disbelief on the man's face, the panic.
No, damn it. I didn't mean to,
he said in a shaky voice. Right at that moment, Mrs. Wolf focused on him, and with only a few wide steps closed the distance between them. Thanks to her shifting attention, however, I could free myself.
Mr. Siegert, we gotta get out of here. They're gonna kill us.
The man just stared at me, his face blank, utterly confused. But within moments, he got a grip on himself. It was too late, though. Mrs. Wolf's body twisted and changed, and within moments, the monstrosity was upon Mr. Siegert. The old man could barely get a hold of his radio. He tried to say something, but when Mrs. Wolf's hands closed around his throat, all that escaped him was indistinguishable screaming. Then she tore the device off of him. As Mrs. Wolf dragged the old man in the direction of the hole the fleshy mass had emerged from, I ran. Pain shot through my entire body. I threw myself against the tarpaulin, and like a trapped animal, clawed at it, tore at it before I found an opening, and slipped through. I was out of it, stumbled on before I screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping to wake people, students, anyone who was still normal, so they could witness the madness that had taken hold of the school. After a few more steps, however, I crashed to the ground, exhausted. An instant later, I pulled myself back up and dragged my body onward. All around me, the school grounds seemed to be alive, and I saw things move in the shadows, keeping an eye on me, watching me, but not yet coming for me. A moment later, I knew why.
Now, Stephen, what are you doing? I got a few questions for you, young man.
It was Mr. Wolfram hurrying toward me. Once more, I screamed at the top of my lungs, not able to form words. But by now, I saw how lights had turned on in some of the dorm rooms. Yes, they must have heard me. Please, oh God, please, someone has to still be normal. Someone has to come and help me. Yet after only a few meters, I was entirely spent. My throat was raw, and I sunk to the ground. Only moments later, Mr. Wolfram reached me. A mocking grin distorted his face, the same one Mrs. Wolf seemed to have learned mere moments ago. With his massive hands, he got a hold of me and began dragging me back towards the construction site. Just at that moment, police sirens reached my ears, and a moment later, a police car came to a halt at the school's gate. 2 police officers exited the car, unlocked the gate, and entered the school grounds. Almost instantly, they noticed me and Mr. Wolfram and made their way towards us. I freed myself from him and stumbled in their direction. Just before I reached them, I heard another voice from behind.
"What brings you here tonight, officers?"
When I turned around, Mrs. Wolf was back, followed by none other than Mr. Siegert. Or rather, his copy.
Siegert, what's the problem here? First you contact us, tell us something might be wrong at the school, then not even 15 minutes later all we hear is distorted noises.
One officer spoke up.
We held a school event this evening, but this boy here, I thought it'd be a good idea to cause trouble. At first I thought he might be a trespasser, but turns out to be nothing but a prank. Tried to call it off, but this thing here,
he said, pointing at his radio,
malfunctioned. Sorry you had to come all the way here.
No, this was wrong. I opened my mouth, wanted to say something, but my voice didn't work.
Well, guess that's it then. Glad there's no trouble. You better fix that radio of yours. All we heard was distortion and what sounded like screaming. Made us fear for the worst. You want us to take the boy in?
No, it was nothing serious. He just wanted to pull a prank on some teachers. He's a bit of a troublemaker, but that's all there is to it.
No, I finally croaked, my voice rough and barely audible. If you leave, they're gonna kill me. I was cut off by Mrs. Wolf, whose booming voice drowned mine out instantly.
Oh, be quiet, Stephen. Enough of your pranks already. This is no game anymore.
I stumbled another few steps in the direction of the officers. It's true, they murdered my friend and...
Hey man, let's just go back to the dorms. I don't want to get in any more trouble.
I heard Eric's voice. I turned around. Hearing him like this, his voice, and seeing this thing, this creature wearing his clothes, made my legs buckle, and I slumped to the floor.
You should listen to your friend, Stephen,
Mr. Siegert chimed in. The officers eyed me for a moment before they sighed.
Well, I guess we'll be going then. Next time you lie to an officer, there'll be consequences, boy. You can handle the rest, right, Siegert? Yes, of course.
No, don't leave. Don't! I stared at them, watched as they turned around and began on their way back to the gate. Mrs. Wolf and Mr. Siegert had already stepped up to me.
Well then, Stephen, time to get back to your room,
Mr. Siegert said, and I felt a cold, hard hand on my shoulder, one ready to restrain me the moment the cops were out of sight. Let go of me, I screamed and threw myself forward. Before anyone could react, I reached the officers, and not knowing what else to do, jumped one of them, swinging my fist right at his face. After a short, surprised second, the man restrained me.
You crazy boy.
Fuck you, you piece of shit, I screamed at him and spit in his face.
Now you've done it,
he said, his face hard. I watched as he took out his handcuffs before he put them on me.
You just earned yourself a night at the station,
he said as he pulled me upward. As he did, I grinned back at the group of fakes behind me.
Is this really necessary? He's just a boy,
Mr. Siegert started.
This boy just assaulted a police officer. It's no damn prank anymore, Siegert.
I couldn't help but laugh as they pushed me towards the police car. They were all still watching me, their faces empty as always. But I could have sworn I saw the anger behind their eyes. The seething, raging anger. And when I did, I laughed even louder. I'd made it. Against all odds, I'd gotten away. The only thing that mattered was that I was alive. Right now, I didn't care about anything else. And as I sat in the back of the police car, and we drove away from the school, I couldn't help but keep laughing and laughing and laughing. As we drove off, and once I'd calmed down, one officer addressed me.
What the hell's the matter with you, boy?
Before I could say anything, his colleague spoke up.
Kid's probably on drugs. No reason to talk to him now.
As he said this, he eyed me through the rearview mirror. When he saw my still beaming expression, his frown only deepened. At the Willow Grove police station, one of them led me to a cell in the back, took off my cuffs, and sat opposite me.
Guess you finally calmed down. So what'd you take, kid?
Nothing. The officer grinned at me. Cut the shit, kid. We're gonna do a blood test anyway, so might as well come clean. I swear, nothing. Sure. Then tell me, why the hell did you attack Officer Harris? For a moment, I almost blurted out what I'd seen at the construction site, and everything else that had happened. But then I forced myself to stop. I remembered how my friends, as well as Mr. Muller, had reacted. There was no way the police would believe a story about flesh monsters and doppelgangers. I had to be smart about this. Think, Stephen, think. They'd have killed me if I didn't, I finally said. The officer sighed and rolled his eyes. Who are they? He asked, humoring me. And why would they do something like that? The officer stared at me, and I could see his face growing angrier by the second. He opened his mouth, ready to call bullshit. But before he could, I spoke up again. Drugs, I almost yelled. I think some teachers are hiding drugs at the school.
I couldn't sleep, and I went for a walk, and that's when I saw them and Mr. Siegert go to the construction area. They had those weird packages with them, and... Bullshit. Are you kidding me? His partner, who was standing outside, spoke up as well. The hell are you trying to pull here, kid? Why do you think all those teachers were there in the middle of the night? Why do you think... Because of the school event. Just like, there was no fucking school event. You can ask any of the other students at the school or check out the website. Why do you think no one else was there? There were no lights or decorations, right? Why do you think they wanted to handle the situation themselves? Why would I lie about it? Not like anyone would believe me. You got that right, the officer sitting across from me said, shaking his head. All right, you'll stay here for the night. Don't cause any more trouble, got it? I nodded. With that, the two of them left the cell and locked it behind themselves. As I lay down on the bunk, I tried my best to listen in on them. The hell kind of bullshit story was that? One of them asked. No clue. Kid's got to be crazy, but, you know, something about this entire thing rubs me the wrong way. Oh, god damn it, Robert. You really think there's something to that kid's story? Doubt it, but... After that, their voices became inaudible. Only when they were gone did I realize how beaten up my body was. Everything hurt, and I was covered in scratches and bruises. But it didn't matter. I was too exhausted. And before I knew it, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the officers informed me they'd contacted my father. He'd be here within the hour to take care of things. Usually I'd be worried. Scared, to be honest, since I knew how hard and strict a man Dad could be. Right now, though, all I wanted was to get as far away as possible from this damn school. I thought Dad would arrive soon after, but, of course, he didn't. I was sure he had more important things to do than to care about his son. It was long past noon when he finally barged into the station, demanding to see me. Couldn't believe it when they called me. Thought it was some kind of joke. Especially after that little call of yours. But here you are, Stephen. This time you really outdone yourself. Do you have any idea? Dad, listen, there's... Quiet. We'll talk later. An officer walked up next to him and opened the cell. Well, Mr. Schmidt, your son's free to leave. At least for now. But he assaulted a police officer. Even if nothing happened. As he said this, his eyes wandered from Dad to me, then back to him. Trust me, there will be consequences, Dad said. He led me from the station, and without another word, ushered me into the car and started it. Dad, please, listen to me, okay? Instead of reacting, he merely stared ahead as we drove from the station. I settled into my seat, thinking about what to tell him, but I didn't even know where to start. Then my head wandered to the car's display. It was already 2 in the afternoon. I wondered if the police actually went to investigate the school or if they just ignored my story. If they did, they'd find that thing, right? It would all be over, wouldn't it? As we continued through town, I wondered where we were going. Wasn't the freeway in a different direction? Dad, aren't we going home? Once again, he said nothing and continued driving. Dad, where are we going? I called out, this time not able to hide the anxiety in my voice. I'd noticed the direction we were going. It was the same damn direction I'd taken so many times when I'd visited Willow Grove. No, he couldn't mean to... You're going back to school, Stephen, he answered matter-of-factly. What? No, we can't. There's something going on at the school. People are dying and... Stop your nonsense, Stephen. I had a good long talk with your principal this morning, and she assured me that everything's all right. No, she's lying, Dad. You gotta listen to me. You don't understand. My voice trailed off. When had he actually talked to her? Had he talked to her over the phone, or had they... My eyes focused on Dad, and for the first time, I truly watched him. I began to feel cold. The way he sat there. The way he just stared ahead. I had thought he would be angry, but...
Slowly, ever so slowly, he seemed to notice my panic. And I watched as his mouth warped into a grin that was exactly the same as I'd seen from Mrs. Wolf and Mr. Wolfram. Then I saw the corners of his mouth twitch slightly. I froze. Oh God, no. Then I remembered what he'd said, and where we were going. No, I couldn't go back to school. I couldn't. They'd kill me the instant I was back. I tore open the seatbelt and reached for the door. Before I could make it, one of Dad's hands got a hold of me and pulled me back into the seat. "We're going back, son," he said. And this time, I could hear his voice cracking, could hear the distortion in it. With an insane amount of strength, he held me in place. And when he turned towards me, his face had grown longer. Nothing but a warped caricature of my father's. I struggled, tore at his hand and fingers, but I couldn't get them off. Then I twisted my body, lifted my feet, and kicked the thing next to me with all the force I could muster. It showed no reaction. Didn't even seem to register the pain. But when I did it again and again, it released me to get a hold of my legs. I screamed in pain when the creature twisted them, but I kept struggling. Frantically, I tore at the car door, got it open, but a second later I was yanked back. I could already see the school's towering walls coming up ahead. Fueled by adrenaline and sheer desperation, I freed one of my legs and kicked the steering wheel as hard as I could. The thing must have not expected it. The car swerved and we crashed right into a tree by the side of the road. My head collided with the dashboard. I saw stars, tasted blood, and for a moment my vision grew blurry. As I drifted off, I screamed at myself to stay awake, and fought against the dark haze that filled my mind. I jerked awake. The car wasn't moving. The creature's hand, however, was still holding onto my leg, twisting it, and I could feel its bony fingers dig through my skin and into my flesh. Its mouth opened, and a high-pitched, distorted sound escaped it. I thought it would drag me to school by itself, but it seemed to be trapped because of the crash. Yet I could see it changing, twisting its body to get free. In an onset of desperation, I began beating down on its hand relentlessly. Its fingers dug deeper into my leg. The car shook, and I heard the grinding of metal as the thing tried to free itself. I beat against it with all the force I could muster, and finally its mangled, broken hand slid off my leg. In an instant, I tore open the car door and pushed myself outside. I fell to the ground, crawled away, but the thing behind me was still stuck. Once more, I heard the grinding of metal, and knew it wouldn't be long, and I knew it would come after me. When I got into my feet, my eyes grew wide. 2 police cars were parked in front of the school. Yes, I screamed in excitement. They'd come after all. My eyes darted around, and I soon noticed a police officer standing next to his car. He still held his radio in his hand, and he was staring at our car, and the accident that had just happened. "Help!" I called out. Right at that moment, Mr. Wolfram stepped out from behind one of the police cars. He pointed at me, and the officer's face focused on me. His eyes were wide open, and his face was devoid of emotions. A moment later, 2 more officers joined him. When they started in my direction, and I noticed their unnatural gait, I ran. On battered legs, I dashed into the forest surrounding the school grounds. I didn't turn around, didn't listen. My body should have been in terrible pain, but I felt nothing. Adrenaline, the shock, I realized. My vision grew blurry again, but I pushed myself on relentlessly, screaming at my body to keep going, to keep working. I ran until my legs gave way, and I crashed to the forest floor. For a moment, I could do nothing but lie there, panting, and the thought of giving up crawled into my mind. It was useless anyway, wasn't it? They'd get me eventually. If I just gave up, it would at least be over. No, I screamed at myself. Keep going. I crawled forward. and by sheer accident, my hand sank into the forest floor next to a fallen trunk. It was a hole. One that was almost entirely hidden. I pushed myself through the underbrush, past the tree trunk covering the hole, most likely tearing myself bloody, and slid inside. For minutes, I couldn't move. My body was shaking with exhaustion. I'd have screamed when the adrenaline ebbed away, but I didn't have the energy left to do so. I don't know how long it took me before I could move again. When I did, I only moved my head so I could see the forest ground in front of me. At first, I saw nothing, but soon I saw the police officers from before. They were searching for me. By now, however, I only recognized them because of their ill-fitting uniforms. Their bodies were so twisted, so warped, they looked as if someone had put random body parts together to form crude amalgamations of the human form. At times, they were walking almost akin to humans. At others, on all fours similar to animals. Their bodies were perpetually shifting, changing. I watched them for what felt like hours, but I heard no words, no exchanges. The only thing I heard were the occasional mechanical clicking sounds. As time went on, more and more of these twisted beings joined the hunt. Former students, I realized. They had to be former students. They too were distorted, and too warped to recognize who they might have once been. Then I heard something. Voices.
Yo, Steven. Where are you?
I heard Martin call out to me.
Yeah, dude. Been looking for you all over the place.
Eric joined in. I could barely cover my mouth to not scream in shock. Why? Why the hell were they here?
You can come out, dude. It's all over.
The fake Martin continued. I stayed quiet, sat there unmoving, not even daring to breathe. It was all so weird, but the teachers explained everything. I heard Kim from nearby. They were all just sick. I began shivering. That was her voice. Her real voice. And I could hear the relief in it. What if it really was over? What if the police had somehow stopped whatever that thing was, and everyone was back to normal? No, stop. Don't fall for it. I'd seen it. I'd seen Eric being consumed. I'd seen how they sucked him dry until nothing remained. Don't go, Steven. Don't go.
You know, son, I might have had it all wrong. Your friends told me what happened. Just come out so we can talk about it. Just the two of us.
Even Dad. Even he was here. Yet I told myself not to react, not to go out, and ignore all the voices that talked to me. They didn't know where I was, and this was nothing but a ploy to lure me out. It had to be. I sat there with tears in my eyes, listening to my best friends, to Kim, my father, and so many others. They told me stories, urged me to come out, trying to convince me to trust in their lies. My body was shaking, my heart was pounding. I wanted to believe it so much. So fucking much. But I still didn't move. As time passed, the voices changed. What were stories and pleas before changed to taunts and insults. Eric and Martin said they'd never been my friends to begin with. My father never cared for me. Everyone else thought I was a freak. Someone who didn't fit in. Suddenly, one of them began screaming, and a shrill, distorted cry reverberated through the forest. I bit my tongue, clenched my jaw, and put my hand over my ears to drown out the noise and the stabbing pain it caused in my ears. Soon others joined in. It was nothing but a mad cacophony. A cacophony of otherworldly, distorted, screeching crying. It lasted for what must have been minutes. I was just like you, Steven. An outcast without friends.
But not anymore. Now I'm like everyone else. It's so much better,
Kim said.
You can join us, Stephen. No more worries. No more pain. And no more jokes or insults.
Yeah, we're the same after all,
Eric and Martin said in unison.
It's the future, Stephen,
Mr. Thomas added. When I heard all this, I grew angry. Angrier even than at all the insults. I wanted to yell at them, to scream at them, to tell them to shut up, to leave me alone, that none of it was true.
You can run. You can't get away. Not someone like you.
Not anymore, my father snapped at me. He was right, wasn't he? What could I do? What could a single person do against something like this? I opened my mouth, almost called out to him, almost told him where I was and that I was done. Then I dug my fingernails into my hands and clenched my mouth shut. No, don't do it. Exhaustion, I told myself. I was out of it and I couldn't think straight anymore. I tried my best not to listen to them. Then I stuffed dirt in my ears, closed my eyes, and concentrated on nothing but the pain my fingernails were causing me. I don't know when night descended, but they were still out there. I could still hear their voices. But soon I passed out. When I awoke, the forest surrounding me was quiet. I heard no voices, no movement, no clicking noises, not even the faintest sound of something breathing nearby. Eventually, after I'd waited and listened for an eternity, and after my eyes had gotten used to the darkness, I began the slow, arduous process of pushing myself from the small hole. Quietly, 1 centimeter at a time, I pushed on. When I was halfway out, I scanned the surrounding area. I saw no movement, none of the twisted, half-hidden students I'd so gotten used to. Once I made it out from the hole, I picked a direction at random and began walking. For what felt like hours, I stumbled through the dark forest haphazardly before I came upon a small hiking track. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was as far away from the school as possible. After following the path for a while, I realized it had led me along the side of one of the hills surrounding the school. My body was aching, and when I noticed the remains of an old resting area, I approached it. I sank down on a half-rotten bench to catch my breath, but told myself not to lie down. I had to keep going. When my eyes wandered over the surrounding scenery, I realized just how far I'd made it. From where I was, I could almost see the entire forest below, but also the school grounds. As I scanned them, I saw the same strange purplish hue coming from the construction site. Once my eyes had gotten used to it, I saw just how many holes and burrows there actually were. It was nothing but a giant crater landscape. I froze when I saw this. I thought there was only one hole. Only one of those things. But there were so many. And I realized where that thing... No. Those things must have come from. They must have come upon them during the ongoing construction. Must have somehow woken them up when they were digging for the new foundations. By now, though, there was no construction going on. What was happening down there was an excavation. They were laying those things bare, however many of them there were. I shuddered when I saw the size of the area, the sheer magnitude of what must still lie hidden underground. In between it all, I saw countless figures, working and digging. I remembered what Kim had told me during the last time I talked to her, during that chat in the morning. She'd seen students and teachers out there. Half in a trance, I watched it all. Eventually, the sun dawned, and all the students and teachers working out there set out to continue their normal days. Continued to pretend. At least, that's what I thought. Half an hour later, a bus arrived in the school parking lot. On the school grounds, I saw rows of students leaving the dorms and lining up. I couldn't be sure, but they were just standing there, waiting diligently before some teachers joined them. The field trip, I realized. Oh God. All those students, I thought. They were all copies. All part of those things. I thought it had been nothing but a trick. A ploy to get rid of anyone who figured out what was going on. But it was actually happening. A second later, I realized why. To spread their influence. And somehow, I knew that each of those students had to be carrying a part of them. A part just like the one I'd seen in the dorm's basement. That way, they could get to universities, to colleges, and nearby schools. So they could learn, and so they could create new clusters. I tore myself from the site and continued on, following the various hiking tracks in the area. When I came upon a road, I just kept walking. I stayed clear of Willow Grove, however. They'd replaced the police, and there was no saying how many other people they'd replaced as well. Instead, I continued on to another town in the area. When I arrived, I set out for the police station. Yet, when I got close to it, I saw the same emotionless faces, the same empty eyes, and heard the same monotonous voices. I walked on for days before I hitchhiked to one of the bigger cities in the area. Yet my hopes were shattered when I saw the same thing everywhere. Empty faces, wide eyes, and twitching mouths. I don't know what to do anymore. Those things, they'd been right. There was no way I could stop this. There was no way I could do anything. This has long since stopped being an isolated incident. This is not just happening in a small boarding school in the middle of nowhere anymore. No. This is an invasion. And the further those things spread, the more they learn. The more they'll know how to act just like us. By now, it might already be too late. By now, they might very well be completely indiscernible from normal human beings. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow, and see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.